My name is Jonathan Klein. I was 28 years old on October 14th, 2019, the night everything changed in Muskegon, Michigan. Listen close, sit nearer if you like, because this isn't one of those ghostly tall tales told to get a reaction. It's the kind of true story that sticks to your bones. I grew up a few towns over, but for the last 5 years I'd been living in a narrow rental above an old bait shop near the mouth of Muskegon Lake. I worked days at a small maritime restoration shop, fixing rot and rust on boats that had been everywhere and nowhere. The work kept me steady, kept me honest. People around the harbor knew me by sight. The unlit cigarettes I never smoked, the battered navy jacket that smelled faintly of diesel. I liked the plainness of my days, the slow rhythm of tide and task, until October rolled in with an impatient wind. Before I tell you about that night, you should know the people I was tangled with then. There was Nora Beckett, the barista at the Red Buoy who could remember everyone's order but not her own. She had a laugh like wind through corn stalks in a backyard with more herbs than you might think. My neighbor, Ellis Harrow, an ex-Coast Guard with permanent creases around his eyes, was the kind of man other men gave directions to when the fog swallowed the shoreline. My sister, June, lived in Grand Rapids and called every Sunday. She was practical and quick to tell me I worried too much. Muskegon itself felt like a character in the story. A city of boatyards and bars, a place where the water was never still and memory clung to the pilings. There were places children dared each other to go. The abandoned pier that groaned like a tired creature. The lighthouse that still pointed a finger into the dark even though the light had been mechanized years ago. The dunes where campers built fires and told stories until the chill chased them home. That kind of geography makes men believe in second chances, and it makes women swear they heard things in the reeds. People say the lake holds on to moments. I came to learn how true that was. In the weeks before October 14, I had been restless. The shop owner's temper had frayed. There was talk of layoffs. Nights grew long, and the wind seemed to whisper old names. I found myself walking the waterfront after midnight, looking for answers I didn't have. I kept a cheap flashlight in my pocket and a little notebook where I scribbled what I couldn't say aloud. My friends noticed. Ellis said I had a look that belonged to men who'd been up too long and seen too much. Nora asked me if I was writing a book. I lied and said yes. I also need to tell you about the old boathouse on Pier 7. It's the kind of place that fits 100 small tragedies. Peeling paint, a sagging roof, the smell of mold and tar. Locals avoided it. They called it the keeper's shed in half-joking tones because once, a long time ago, someone had kept watch there and never left. Teenagers dared one another to sprint through its shadow at dusk. Fishermen left offerings of smoke and muttered apologies on mornings when their rigs were missing. I liked the boathouse in a way. It was private, thinly lit, and had a shelf where you could lay your problems out like tools. And like a fool, I started going there when sleep wouldn't come. There are ordinary reasons why a man finds himself in odd places at odd hours. The need for quiet. The wish to be near water when decisions must be made. I had more practical ones too. Sometimes clients would drop off boats' parts at midnight. Sometimes the shop needed to move a hull and we'd work under blue floodlights. But the boathouse had this other quality. It listened. When you stood inside it, you could hear the lake speak against the pilings, the city breathe at the far end of the pier. It felt like truth, even when it wasn't. I tell you all this because a story needs its frame, its cast, its weather. You need to know who I was and who I leaned on so that when the strange thing threaded through the ordinary, you'll understand how quickly ordinary frays. People asked later, why that night? Why Muskegon? Why me? Those questions are real, but they get mixed with rumor and fear. I can't answer all of them. I can give you what I remember. For months prior, I had been finding small, odd things. A child's shoe tucked under a piling that I knew no child had left. A note, damp and curled, with 3 letters on it, M-E-L, and nothing more. A shadow at the corner of the Red Buoy that uncurled itself like a sleeping animal and then was gone. I thought perhaps I was tired, perhaps the weight of work and the weather had started to sharpen my imagination. But other people saw things too. Nora's cousin swore she heard a woman singing on the lake at dawn. Ellis found fresh footprints at the high tide line. prints that led nowhere and had no known maker. And so on October 14th, 2019, after a late shift at the shop and a quiet drink at the Red Buoy, I walked to the pier with my coat pulled tight. The moon was a sliver, the shoreline a black tooth against the velvet of the lake. The city light. My name is Jonathan Klein. I was 28 years old on October 14th, 2019, the night everything changed in Muskegon, Michigan. Listen close, sit nearer if you like, because this isn't one of those ghostly tall tales told to get a reaction. It's the kind of true story that sticks to your bones. I grew up a few towns over, but for the last 5 years I'd been living in a narrow rental above an old bait shop near the mouth of Muskegon Lake. I worked days at a small maritime restoration shop, fixing rot and rust on boats that had been everywhere and nowhere. The work kept me steady, kept me honest. People around the harbor knew me by sight. The unlit cigarettes I never smoked, the battered navy jacket that smelled faintly of diesel. I liked the plainness of my days, the slow rhythm of tide and task, until October rolled in with an impatient wind. Before I tell you about that night, you should know the people I was tangled with then. There was Nora Beckett, the barista at the Red Buoy who could remember everyone's order but not her own. She had a laugh like wind through corn stalks in a backyard with more herbs than you might think. My neighbor, Ellis Harrow, an ex-Coast Guard with permanent creases around his eyes, was the kind of man other men gave directions to when the fog swallowed the shoreline. My sister, June, lived in Grand Rapids and called every Sunday. She was practical and quick to tell me I worried too much. Muskegon itself felt like a character in the story. A city of boatyards and bars, a place where the water was never still and memory clung to the pilings. There were places children dared each other to go. The abandoned pier that groaned like a tired creature. The lighthouse that still pointed a finger into the dark even though the light had been mechanized years ago. The dunes where campers built fires and told stories until the chill chased them home. That kind of geography makes men believe in second chances, and it makes women swear they heard things in the reeds. People say the lake holds on to moments. I came to learn how true that was. In the weeks before October 14, I had been restless. The shop owner's temper had frayed. There was talk of layoffs. Nights grew long, and the wind seemed to whisper old names. I found myself walking the waterfront after midnight, looking for answers I didn't have. I kept a cheap flashlight in my pocket and a little notebook where I scribbled what I couldn't say aloud. My friends noticed. Ellis said I had a look that belonged to men who'd been up too long and seen too much. Nora asked me if I was writing a book. I lied and said yes. I also need to tell you about the old boathouse on Pier 7. It's the kind of place that fits 100 small tragedies. Peeling paint, a sagging roof, the smell of mold and tar. Locals avoided it. They called it the keeper's shed in half-joking tones because once, a long time ago, someone had kept watch there and never left. Teenagers dared one another to sprint through its shadow at dusk. Fishermen left offerings of smoke and muttered apologies on mornings when their rigs were missing. I liked the boathouse in a way. It was private, thinly lit, and had a shelf where you could lay your problems out like tools. And like a fool, I started going there when sleep wouldn't come. There are ordinary reasons why a man finds himself in odd places at odd hours. The need for quiet. The wish to be near water when decisions must be made. I had more practical ones too. Sometimes clients would drop off boats' parts at midnight. Sometimes the shop needed to move a hull and we'd work under blue floodlights. But the boathouse had this other quality. It listened. When you stood inside it, you could hear the lake speak against the pilings, the city breathe at the far end of the pier. It felt like truth, even when it wasn't. I tell you all this because a story needs its frame, its cast, its weather. You need to know who I was and who I leaned on so that when the strange thing threaded through the ordinary, you'll understand how quickly ordinary frays. People asked later, why that night? Why Muskegon? Why me? Those questions are real, but they get mixed with rumor and fear. I can't answer all of them. I can give you what I remember. For months prior, I had been finding small, odd things. A child's shoe tucked under a piling that I knew no child had left. A note, damp and curled, with 3 letters on it, M-E-L, and nothing more. A shadow at the corner of the Red Buoy that uncurled itself like a sleeping animal and then was gone. I thought perhaps I was tired, perhaps the weight of work and the weather had started to sharpen my imagination. But other people saw things too. Nora's cousin swore she heard a woman singing on the lake at dawn. Ellis found fresh footprints at the high tide line, prints that led nowhere and had no known maker. And so on October 14th, 2019, after a late shift at the shop and a quiet drink at the Red Buoy, I walked to the pier with my coat pulled tight. The moon was a sliver, the shoreline a black tooth against the velvet of the lake. The city lights behind me were a low hum, and the water in front of me was a dark field, thick with possibility. I had my notebook, I had my flashlight. I had half a mind to put both away and call June and tell her I was coming home. Now. And this is where the story shifts and where the thing I've been circling finally steps into the open. I'll tell you what actually happened that night. What I felt, what I heard, and how the ordinary place I thought I knew became something else entirely. Keep your hand on the arm of your chair. The best stories don't let go of you easily. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I kept my flashlight low as I stepped onto the pier because light draws attention out here, to gulls, to other people, and to things that should stay hidden. The boards creaked under my boots in that way they always do, a tired complaint that the tide answered with a soft, sucking sound. I walked the length toward the sagging boathouse, and for a long stretch there was nothing but the regular music of the place. Water nudging wood, a distant car, the stray bark of a dog somewhere inland. Then, beneath it all, there was another sound, a quiet, threadbare singing like someone humming while they stitched. If you've ever heard the lake sing, you know it can imitate 100 voices. On good nights, it's gulls. On bad nights, it borrows the lilt of a child's lullaby and makes it into something that sits wrong in your chest. This singing was low, tuneless, and it seemed to come from just beyond the boathouse, where the light didn't reach and the pilings fell into black water. My hand tightened on the flashlight. I felt the small animal warning flare people get when something's not right. The door to the boathouse was ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry or had been pushed out. The inside smelled of damp rope and old varnish, and there, on the workbench, lay another scrap of paper folded into a hard little square. I almost didn't touch it, but curiosity and that private compulsion I kept in a notebook had me unfold it. The 3 letters were there again. M-E-L. Same damp curling edge as the others. Someone had written them in a different hand, more deliberate, as if carving initials into wood. I traced the letters with my thumb and looked up. The singing had stopped. The air tasted of iron and cold. The flashlight caught a line of footprints through the sand at the edge of the pilings. They led from the boathouse to the water and then stopped. No track led back. Someone or something had walked into the Lake Michigan tide and simply vanished. Ellis's face came to my mind, a man who had navigated fogs and storms, who read the world in buoys and bell signals. I thought of asking him to come, of calling Nora to stay open and wait for me, but pride and a stupid, private desire gripped me. I wanted to see for myself. I wanted to know whether the water had swallowed evidence of a prank, or whether it had begun to swallow people. I pocketed the note, left the boathouse, and followed the footprints. They led to a small inlet where old rowboats lay half-buried and green at the edges. Moonlight skimmed the tops of ripples. There, tied to a broken cleat, was a boat I didn't recognize, a skiff, light, one oar still clinging to its rowlocks. The oar bore scratch marks that looked like letters if you squinted. I set my flashlight on the gunwale and leaned close. The wood smelled faintly of perfume, an odd perfume for a place of oil and salt, but unmistakable, lavender and something heavier, like cloves. Then I heard it again, a whisper at the waterline. "Jonathan," someone breathed. It was my name, but not in my voice. I stopped dead. The world narrowed to the beam of my flashlight and the sound of my own blood. Whoever or whatever called me knew me. That stitch of recognition tugged at something deeper. The note, M-E-L, the footprints, the singing. It threaded them all together. "Who's there?" I asked, and my voice thin as glass. No reply. The oar bobbed lightly as if stirred by something unseen. I reached for it and the boat shifted. For a heartbeat, I saw the silhouette of a figure in the hull, a woman curled, knees to chest, hair matted around her face. She looked like she'd been sleeping, but the way the light hit her skin made it almost translucent. The breath left me as if my chest had been compressed. "Don't," she said, though the sound might have come from the water itself. "Please." I wanted to climb down, to pull her into the light, to find out everything. I also wanted to run. The two impulses warred in my stomach. I told myself she might be cold, lost, in need of help. Men and women go missing from the shoreline sometimes. Sometimes they slip and drown. Sometimes they wander off in a fog and don't remember where they slept. The practical part of me, the part that could splice a rotten hull and patch a seam, told me to do the sensible thing. Call for help, get a rope, secure the boat. The other part, the part that had been keeping bad company with sleeplessness and whispers, pushed me forward. I climbed down the pilings and knelt on the old timbers, reaching toward the woman in the boat. Her hair slid from her face, and she looked up at me. The flashlight caught her eyes, and I will swear to you that they were familiar. Not because I knew the woman, I didn't, but because they reflected something I had seen before. June's tired face the morning after a storm, Nora staring at a pastry case, Ellis squinting into fog. They reflected a longing so vast it made my throat ache. "You've got to let me help," I said, trying for a calm I didn't feel. "Who are you? Are you all right?" She smiled then, but it wasn't a smile that matched her distress. It was the kind of smile people give when they remember something they don't want to remember and put on politeness instead. "MEL," she said, looking at the scrap of paper in my pocket without me giving it any thought. "She left me a note." The words were simple. The implication wasn't. The woman's hand brushed the oar, and my flashlight made a thin diamond on her ring finger. An old, tarnished band with a small chip where the metal had been struck. I knew in a way I could not explain that this boat had belonged to someone long gone, or to someone who should have been long gone. The name on the note echoed again in my mind like a bell. Mel. I thought of the initials of the notes left half hidden around town. I thought of footprints that led into water like a person who'd finally decided to stop walking on land. Then the water moved in a way it didn't have a right to. The boat strained on its mooring, and for a breath, the woman in the skiff seemed to thin, like smoke being pulled to a seam. I grabbed for her hand, and it was cold as the lake and thin as a dead leaf. My fingers closed around nothing. The hand slipped through like steam. Panic tasted metallic in my mouth. "Hold on!" I yelled, but there was no one to hear in the cold open air but the gulls and the pier. The skiff drifted, the light trembled, and when I looked again, the shape in the hull had gone. Only the oar remained, and the scent of lavender, and my pulse in my ears like someone running. I scrambled back up to the pier, breath tearing in my chest. My hands were shaking in a way they never had before. I held the flashlight out and scanned the water, the pilings, the face of the moon. The skiff bobbed empty in the tide, moored to nothing but memory. No footprints led away. No sound came from the boathouse but the creak of old timbers. The scrap of paper in my pocket felt heavier than before, and when I looked down, I noticed a new mark smeared into the corner of the page. A crescent of salt, and what looked suspiciously like a smear of dried blood. I didn't sleep that night. I walked the pier until dawn, and when the first pale light came over Muskegon Lake, I called Ellis. He came within the hour with a lantern and the kind of face that men get when they need to be useful. Nora opened the red buoy before anyone asked, and her hands were steady as she brewed coffee for 3. We pulled the skiff to the dock, prodded around under the pilings, and checked the tide lines. There were no more scraps, no witnesses. But the oar, when Ellis examined it, had letters scratched so deep the wood had split. MEL, in a hand that might have been the same as mine, or may have been his, depending on which way you turned your head. At noon, a report came through the police scanner. A small camper near the dunes had been found with the engine gone cold, a basket of herbs overturned. Someone I'd never met before mentioned a missing woman named Melissa Rowe who'd left town years earlier and whose case had grown cold. The threads were knitting themselves into a pattern, or perhaps they were only tying themselves into knots. Either way, my life shifted into the kind of small, sharp business of following those threads. June called and I lied about sleep again. That night, and I don't say this lightly, the lake hummed as if it had remembered something important and would not let it go. I slept for an hour, maybe 2, and woke in a puddle of fear. The house above the bait shop felt too small and the harbor too loud. The scrap of paper burned in my pocket like a promise. I won't tell you everything that happened next. Not yet. But know this, something followed me from the pier. It found its way into the lightest corners of my daily life, into lunch counters, into the back of my eyelids when I closed them, into the little notebook where I wrote because writing made sense of small things. It whispered names that felt like mine and showed me places that had no right to exist, and when it touched me, I could not tell if I was being comforted or claimed. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The weeks that followed felt like living inside a story someone else was telling and I had stumbled into the middle of. Once the skiff bobbed empty and the oar with MEL carved deep into it, there was no walking away. Ellis, Nora, and I began to dig, not with shovels at first, but with questions. We checked old police reports. Melissa Rowe, missing, case opened 1997, closed as runaway. We talked to men who remembered a woman who worked shifts at the waterfront diner and who loved lavender-scented soap. We found a faded photograph in the county archives of a girl with a crooked grin and a ribbon in her hair. The name fit too neatly into the holes we'd been tripping over. The initials on my scrap, the scent on the oar, the ring in the skiff, the lake had been speaking in breadcrumbs. The police were polite at first, then polite and annoyed, then polite and finally uncomfortable. A detective named Marcus Trent, broad-shouldered, too young, and too stern for his years, took my notebook and read my shaky handwriting as if it were evidence rather than the ramblings of a man who hadn't slept. He ordered us to stop poking around the pier at night. He said there were procedures, and we said the lake had different procedures that didn't care for paper and procedure. He put a file in a drawer and a promise in the air that he'd look into the old case. A week later, a storm came that drowned the harbor in a wash of salt and rain. After it cleared, we found the pier damage stretched like an old bruise. A piling's gone, ropes shredded, a small, rusted locker half buried in wet sand. In that locker, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, was a shoe the county records matched to Melissa Rowe's missing property, a rusted copper locket with a picture the same as the archive photo, and a folded, brittle piece of paper that had been wet and pressed for years. The initials were there, in ink browned like old tea, MEL. The paper smelled of salt and lavender. The detective could no longer look annoyed. There are moments when the world concedes to you in the oddest of ways. The discovery reopened the old case officially. Worn files were exhumed. Men who had been quiet for decades suddenly remembered details. The neighbor who'd seen a late-night argument on a porch, the drunk who claimed a truck sped down the lane and into the fog, a fisherman who swore he heard a voice singing at the waterline and told no one because he feared they'd think him soft. They found evidence of a private life that had been hidden. Letters, a journal where Melissa wrote of being watched, of someone who said love and meant possession. Her last entries were the least coherent, page after page about a keeper who kept watch and about the lake wanting to take what was owed. Whether the lake wanted her or someone else wanted to hide her or both, the paper couldn't settle on a single story. But the locker, the shoe, the locket, these were physical things that made the intangible press against the world and leave a mark. The town had to notice. They pulled the old pilings and scanned the mud at the foundation. It was a gruesome, careful process, one that made me want to look away and that also gnawed at me until I forced myself to stay. In the soft muck, under an old crossbeam, they found what we feared. Remains, fragmentary and water-gnawed, but enough. Identification took time. The lab moves in its slow, comfortable way. When the result finally arrived, when they called me and said, "It's her," there was a hole in me like a missing tooth. You might think finding an answer brings peace. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it only makes the questions louder. The coroner ruled as gently as a man can. Accidental death with complicating circumstances, old injuries, and the way the tides rearranged truth. Some in town whispered about a cover-up, fingers pointing at a man who'd vanished from Muskegon a year after Melissa did. Others said the lake had claimed itself another secret. The detective made arrests, and then the case split and folded like a paper fortune teller. Some faces were cleared, others were questioned in courtrooms where the public is supposed to judge, but often just whispers. In the end, the legal world did what it could. Indictments, plea deals, truths that tasted like half coins. The lake did what it had always done, kept its cold counsel. For me, the resolution was messier. Finding Melissa's things and getting her name back into the light didn't undo what had followed me from the pier. If anything, it tightened its grip. I began to dream of the woman in the skiff in broad daylight, not as a thing to be dredged, but as a person who refused to be neat even after she was found. Her voice returned in corners, but it was softened by gratitude, or maybe by the way people say thank you just before they leave. Once, standing at the harbor while the sun split the water into glittering teeth, I heard my name called not in accusation, but as a benediction. It was a small mercy. I realized later that mercy had its own currency. I had been afraid of being claimed by the thing I couldn't name, the lake, guilt, the past. But the more I acted, the less it felt like theft and more like stewardship. We held a small private memorial the day the lab released its report. Nora brought lavender wrapped in paper. Ellis read a short note he'd written that was more apology than eulogy. June came down for the weekend. We buried the locket near the dunes where Melissa had liked to watch fog roll in, and when we left, there was a hush on the water that felt less like accusation and more like release. Do people stop hearing things after closure? No, not always. I still hear a lone hum tune when I'm up late, a small thread of melody that tugs at the ragged edges of memory. Sometimes it's Nora singing to herself while she washes cups. Sometimes it's the lake. I learned to live with it. It became part of the weather of my life. Unpredictable, sometimes harsh, often beautiful in its own small, terrible way. I stayed in Muskegon for a while after everything settled, long enough to see the pier repaired enough for light traffic, long enough to patch some engines, long enough for a detective to close a file with more questions than answers, but with a name finally spoken aloud. Eventually, work pulled me away. Places remember you, and you remember them, and people change states of mind like seasons. I left a small stone at the locket's burial site the last day I drove away. June cried in the car, but not only for Melissa. She cried for the way the town had been a little less gentle than it should have been, for the people who vanish under the weight of quiet, for the fact that some stories have to be forced into daylight. If there's a moral here, it's not tidy. Names matter. Listening matters. If a place seems to be calling, that sometimes it is because it needs to be heard, not because it seeks to harm the hearing. The lake kept its secrets for years. It shared one with us and demanded attention in return. We paid as best we could. And me? I carry the scrap of paper with MEL in my notebook still, pages pressed tight so the letters don't rub away. There are nights when I wake and the house above the bait shop smells faintly of lavender and salt. There are nights when I feel the cold of the oar slipping through my fingers, but there are also mornings when the harbor looks ordinary, and ordinary is a kind of mercy. This is a true story because these things happen to people who live here. They happened to me. They changed us, and the lake kept singing whether or not we listened. If you're ever in Muskegon and you stand on the pier at the right hour, you might hear a note that sounds like a name. Say it aloud. Some names like being said. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Evan Rowe. I was 28 years old when it happened, the night of October 12th, 2019, and I still hear the gulls sometimes and feel the cold of that harbor wind like a bruise. I tell you this sitting at my kitchen table with a cup gone cold, because some things don't leave you even when you try to pack them away. This is a true story from Muskegon, Michigan. Not a ghost tour yarn, not something built to get clicks. It started small, with broken things and small silences, and then widened until it filled the whole night. Muskegon was the kind of town where everybody knew where you worked and what truck you drove. I grew up on the north side near a stretch of shoreline people thought was ordinary. Docks, a string of seafood shacks, the old Coast Guard boathouse that smelled like diesel and varnish. My father used to say the lake carried secrets like you carry scars out of sight, but always there. He wasn't wrong. He just didn't know how noisy those secrets could be. I repaired boats at a little shop off Harbor Street. My boss, a grizzled ex-salver named Ron Calder, called me steady hands and trusted me with engines that had been chewed by salt and storms. Ron was a former Coast Guard mate who kept a faded photograph of a rescue taped inside his locker. People like Ron teach you to look for small, telltale things: a snapped cleat, a smear of oil where it shouldn't be, and in footprints that don't match the number of people on a job. Those are the things that tell you when the ordinary is breaking. There were a few people in my life that October who mattered to the story. Jonas Keller, my closest friend, worked nights at the marina and fancied himself a local historian. He collected rumors and labeled them evidence. Maggie Bell ran the bait shop and could spot a lie faster than she could bait a hook. Sheriff Franklin Oakes, old Frank, kept a quiet ledger of all the town's small troubles and liked to pretend nothing worse than a missing fishing pole ever troubled Muskegon. I knew these people the way you know street names. Familiar contours, sometimes useful, sometimes not. The troubled thing about Muskegon was its quiet traditions. There was a stretch of pier nobody walked at night, not because of anything obvious, but because the wind there sounded like whispered names. Old fishermen would tell you about the drift, a strange current near the old power plant that snagged more nets than it should. They'd joke about the lake being picky, that Lake Michigan preferred to keep to itself. It was the kind of superstition that lives in the pause between sentences. You never asked too many questions about it in front of strangers. That month, the town felt thinner. Boats that usually bobbed by the slip were tied tighter. People left earlier from the bait shop. The high school football lights came down quicker. There were small things. A light left on in Ron's workshop when Ron was not there. 3 plastic chairs stacked outside the Coast Guard building at odd hours. A smell of wet wood and something metallic when I walked home from a late job. We all shrugged. Things break. Winters come early in Michigan. I had my own reasons for being watchful. My sister Hannah lived across town and was pregnant then. She called me every few nights with little crises, twisted bed sheets, an unsteady step on the porch, and I would drive across town to fix whatever had happened. Maybe that's why, the week before the 12th, I started noticing tracks in the mud near the old lighthouse. They were not animal prints. They were not the neat boot marks of a fisherman. They were long and shallow, like something dragged. I mentioned them to Jonas, and he smiled that sideways smile of his and said, "Muskegon is getting restless, Ev. Maybe the lake wants conversation." Ron frowned when I told him. "Keep your head," he said. "People make stories out of shadows. Engines make more noise than ghosts." That made me feel better for a night. But on the second day, the bait shop's plywood shutter was off its hinges, and someone had scrawled a crooked circle in the dust of the shop window. Maggie was pale when I saw her. "Weird kids," she said, "or drunks." But her hands trembled when she handed over my usual pack of squid. The immediate lead up to October 12th was ordinary in its small annoyances. A tugboat's GPS failed at dawn and sent a barge dragging. We patched the lines. A woman reported her dog gone from a gated yard near the harbor, and old Frank put it down as ran away. Each time I drove home, the sky over the lake was a low, bruised gray that made the water look like iron. I was sleeping poorly, waking with a dampness at the back of my throat that tasted like the engine room of an old ship. People in town started whispering about a missing man from a neighboring county, a transient who'd been seen near the power plant. But no one seemed to connect that to the odd noises we were hearing on the quay at night. A methodical scraping, like someone pulling something heavy across rotten wood. That's how it was, with danger in a small town. It arrived in increments, in unremarkable sounds and shifted glances. The night of October 12th arrived with a wind that had the urgency of a message. I was finishing work in the shop when Jonas showed up, breathless. "You heard it?" he said without preface. He had his scarf wrapped tight and his eyes were blown wide like he'd seen something he couldn't ignore. Jonas never looked that way unless he'd found a loose end. "There's been lights on the old pier," he said. "Not the pier lights, something else. And someone messed with Maggie's trap nets. She found them with holes cut like teeth marks on canvas." He wanted to go look. He wanted to go then. Normally, we would have called Frank, or at least waited for daylight. But there's a particular kind of curiosity that will shove aside prudence when the town you love starts to shift. I told myself I was going because the night made me restless. because I wanted to prove there was nothing to worry about. I told myself a lot of things people tell themselves before they walk toward trouble. We took my pickup, windows cracked against the wind, and drove through the sleeping center of Muskegon. The harbor lights were a smear, and the lapping of water against pilings sounded like someone moving furniture in an empty house. The pier ahead looked longer than I remembered, the shadows between the pilings black and uncertain. Jonas clicked off his flashlight and we parked a good distance away. He shrugged. "We watch," he said. "We don't go onto the wood. Just watch." That was the plan, until I heard it. A sound like a glass being dragged across a table, the slow, measured scraping that had been a rumor for days. It came from the pier. It came from the direction of the old Coast Guard boathouse, where the waves bit at the beams. I felt my throat tighten. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide. It was making a deliberate noise, like someone trying to get attention. I took a step toward the pier. And that is where I'll leave you for now, because the air changed in a way words have trouble carrying, and the night sharpened into something that wanted answers at any cost. What we found on the pier, the footprints, the absence of sound where there should have been voices, the thing that shouldn't exist on the harbor at all, is what I will tell you next. But before I do, know this. Towns like Muskegon teach you to mind the small things. They are the only clues you have when the big thing shows up. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We creaked across the gravel toward the pier like men who know the sound of danger and want to pretend they don't. Jonas kept the flashlight off because his theory was that light made people show themselves. I kept it off because the night seemed to eat every bright thing. We walked in the shadow of the boathouse until the scraping sound stopped, as if whoever, whatever, had been making it had decided to listen back. The boardwalk smelled of tar and old fish. Under the pier, the water slapped the pilings with a hush you could feel under your boots. I remember thinking how small those sounds were compared to the noise that worry makes inside a man's chest. We moved slow, listening to the harbor breathe. The first oddity was the footprints. They started at the lip of the pier where the old safety rail had been half torn away, like someone had used the missing section as a door. The prints were not neat boot prints. They were smudged, long, and shallow, as if something heavy had been dragged and footsteps had occasionally pressed down through the drag marks. Jonas crouched and ran his gloved fingers along the edge of a print without touching it. "Not right," he whispered. "These are too straight. Someone tried not to leave a trail." We followed the marks toward the boathouse. The doors were slightly ajar, a sliver of black cutting into the weak yellow halo of the harbor lamps. Something inside shifted and a metal clink echoed. My throat tightened. Ron had taught me to carry a small pry bar in my truck. I had it now, a stupid, comforting weight against my hip. We pushed the door and a smell hit us. Wet canvas, gasoline, and something sharper like iron and old cloth. Inside, the boathouse looked wrong. Ropes lay coiled where they'd never be. Tarps were rolled as if someone had hurriedly covered something, and on a workbench was a single rubber glove and its cuff frayed and a dark smudge at its finger. There were nets hung on a nail with enough care to look accidental and a pair of binoculars facing out a window. On the floor near the back lay a child's shoe half buried in sawdust. Small things, all of them. Small things in Muskegon add up too quickly. Jonas moved toward a rowboat, pulled inside on blocks. Its bottom had been scraped in a pattern that told of frequent hard use, but there was a fresh gouge along the gunwale that looked like something sharp had been forced through the wood. Near that gouge, we found a torn corner of a jacket, a synthetic that could have been a jogger's windbreaker. I recognized the brand. Hannah had one like it. For a second, my head swam. Then I told myself I was being foolish. People lose clothing by the water all the time. We were about to leave when a sound made both of us still as statues. The low, wet thump of something hitting water. It came from the far side of the boathouse where a narrow sluice gave way to a shallow cove. Someone, or something, had pushed something heavy into the water. The noise sank into the night like a stone. Jonas looked at me, and his face had a hardness I don't like to remember. "We should call Frank," he said. I hesitated. That hesitation is a small theft that can cost you everything. I told Jonas to wait while I took a look. I told myself I'd only peek, that we would call Frank the minute we knew what we were looking at. I remember the cold of the light through the slats as I pressed my hand to the wood and peered out. A row of pilings separated the boathouse's small inlet from the open harbor, and floating against one of them was something dark and cylindrical, wrapped in canvas and tied with twine. My throat closed. I could not tell at first whether it was a log or something alive. Then a gull landed on the far piling and shivered. The gull's landing made the canvas shift, and I saw the outline of a shape. A pair of boots, maybe, the suggestion of a shoulder. My hands went slick with sweat. Jonas touched my sleeve. "Ev," he said very softly. I realized I had stopped breathing. We pulled the boat out with a plan that looked braver on paper than it did in practice. We found an old dolly, its wheels jammed, and we dragged. The whole time the harbor watched and gave nothing away. When we rolled the canvas toward the light, the twine slipped and the top came loose. I felt like a hand had on my chest. Inside the canvas was a torso curled tight, arms fixed at odd angles. The face was turned away. I didn't immediately register the smell until Jonas swore and stepped back. The thing under the tarp wasn't living. It had been kept for nothing, but it had been warmed recently enough that it still held a memory of breath. We called Sheriff Oakes then. Old Frank answered on the second ring, and I could hear the pinched worry in his voice. He told us to stay put. "Don't touch nothing more," he said. "Get out of there and wait." We did. For a while, we stood with our backs to the cold lumbered wall of the boathouse and watched the waves. My phone battery read 22% as if the night had eaten electricity too. Jonas kept whispering theories, half hysterical, about drifters and scrap gangs and illegal fishing operations. I kept seeing Hannah's jacket fragment and the child's shoe. Smallness made poison. When Frank and his deputy arrived, the boathouse filled with official sounds. Radios, the crunch of boots, a flashlight beam sliding like a white shark. They humored us with questions we could answer, and then began to work the scene with a steadiness that was almost comforting. The thing in the canvas was pulled onto a tarp and unwrapped with gloved hands. When it was revealed, the whole world seemed to edge toward silence. It was, in fact, not a body from our missing transient rumors. The man or the figure was older, local maybe, or maybe not. There was no identification on him. He had been bound and wrapped carefully, the manner of it deliberate, like work done by someone used to seams and knots. There were bruises and marks, but there was also something else that made even the sheriff go pale. A series of numbers scratched into the inside of his wrist, precise and tidy. Not a phone number, not a name, just numbers. Jonas said a bad word. I only looked at the water and thought of the dragging marks. Whoever had put him there had wanted the lake to carry him away. Whoever had bound him wanted no one to find whatever story was inside him. Frank took over, talking quietly into his radio. He asked me whether I'd seen anyone at the pier earlier. I told him the truth. The scraping, the footprints, the glove, the torn jacket. He nodded and said he'd call the state. His voice turned to the kind you use when the small town rules have been breached. "We'll lock this down," he said. "No one leaves until we have answers." But the town is full of people who don't like being locked down. Word was reaching the harbor, a whisper at the diner, an anxious tenant at the bait shop, and soon a small crowd gathered beyond the yellow tape, faces pale and angry in the halo of headlights. Maggie was there, her hands raw from clenching, and Hannah stood at the back with a coat wrapped tight and eyes too wide. Seeing her there was like a fist. I had to tell her to go home. She wouldn't leave. She stood and watched like the rest of us, a small figure in a bigger, incomprehensible problem. That night, under the yellow tape, Frank told the crowd what little he could. "We found a man," he said. "We don't know who he is. We'll do what we can." He looked at me when he said it. "You two stay for questions." They took photographs and made lists of who had been where. Someone found a fishing license in the wet that matched a name from out of county. Someone else swore they had seen a dark van, old, dented, leaving the far side of the harbor an hour before. Investigations are like nets. You throw them and hope the evidence will tangle. This one smelled like rotten bait already. The thing that made my stomach clench was something I couldn't name. The certainty that the man in the canvas wasn't the last secret. The clockwork numbers on his wrist felt like an omen, as if someone had signed a ledger. And the scraping, that deliberate, loud scraping, told me he hadn't been alone when it ended. We left when Frank told us to go, but the harbor didn't leave us. The image of the wrapped man followed in the corners of my eyes. I went home to a dark house and couldn't sleep, because every shadow in the room threatened to turn into rope. I kept picturing the pier's missing rail, the way a door could be taken and given again. I kept thinking of small things, a child's shoe, a torn jacket, a glove, and how, in Muskegon, small things could form a map if you looked long enough. The next morning, the town woke as if from a punch. People had the weary, thin look of those who had been kept up. The newspapers wouldn't say much yet. Frank's deputies worked the harbor with a careful, surgical patience, and someone had booked the boathouse for cleanup by noon, which felt like an attempt to scrub memory. But you cannot scrub water from wood. You cannot wipe the numbers off a wrist with newspaper. The harbor had spoken, and it had more to say. What happened next? How the search expanded, what the forensics turned up, the thing that broke the small-town calm into something raw, is what I'll tell you in the next part of this story. For now, remember the way the canvas sagged around the shoulders, the way Jonas swore, the way Sheriff Oak's jaw worked when he examined the numbers. Those are the small things that stitch the rest together. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The next days felt like wandering through a town that had been turned inside out. People who had once smiled at you across Main Street now kept their faces clipped thin. The sheriff's deputies were polite, but brittle. The state lab called with words you don't want to hear in the middle of the night: preliminary, hold, pending. And all of them meant the town would not be allowed to forget. I tried to keep working at Ron's shop because keeping your hands busy is the oldest trick there is for keeping panic from settling into your bones. But every time I tightened a clamp or tuned a carburetor, my mind slid back to the boathouse, to that wrapped shape, to the numbers etched clean into skin like a small, cruel code. Forensics came back faster than I expected. The county coroner, a soft man named Dr. Leland, met with Frank and me in the little conference room at the sheriff's office. He walked us through the facts with a slow, clinical sympathy that made the room feel colder. The man in the canvas had no identification, but he was local. Small tattoos on the forearm hinted at things grown men get to hide. A faded anchor, a name crossed out. The wounds were old and new, and the cause of death was blunt force trauma with complications that suggested he had been restrained and kept for a time before being released into the water. The thing that made Dr. Leland pause and made my skin crawl were those numbers. They were precise, he said. A date, maybe, or coordinates. Whoever had done this knew how to leave a signature without giving away their own hand. Frank said little. The sheriff's face was a landscape of tired lines. We're making some calls, he said. We're checking missing persons and storage units. If anyone heard or saw anything, now's the time to say it. He looked at me when he said that, and I felt for the first time how close this thing had come to me. Word moved in the town like smoke. At the bait shop, Maggie needed coffee the way some people need oxygen. She paced when she spoke, her hands folded and then not. Ev, you saw that jacket piece, she said. You're sure? I told her what I knew, the small things that sat like stones inside my chest. She nodded, slow and hard. We had a report about a missing handyman down by the old paper mill years ago. People forget. They want to. But if there's a pattern... She didn't finish the sentence. No one wanted to finish it. Then there was Jonas. After nights of answering questions and replaying the thing over in my head, I went home to my truck and found his jacket draped over the passenger seat like he just stepped out. His flashlight lay on the floor with the batteries half full. His keys were still in the ignition. At first, I thought he'd come back to finish our talk, but he hadn't. His phone went straight to voicemail. The truck was parked near the marina, right where we'd left it, but the back gate to the slip was open, and the chain that usually held Jonas's toolbox was cut. I told Frank. The sheriff's face took on the look of a man who has learned the geography of bad nights. We treat this as a missing person, he said, but we also lock down the harbor for now. If Jonas's truck's here and he's not, either he left on foot or something happened. His voice was even, but the deputy who stood behind him kept rubbing at the back of his neck like he wanted to scrub the worry off. A missing friend is a particular kind of knife. You know immediately, intimately, that every hour matters. I walked the stretch of the harbor we all knew, the boathouse, the pier, the stables of fishing boat hulls, calling Jonas's name until the sound felt like a stone dropped down a well. People glanced at me with the same expression, worry wrapped in resignation. Jonas's mother came down to the sheriff's office and sat in Frank's lobby like she had been emptied of her shape. Old Frank put his hand on her shoulder like that was something that could hold a town together. It couldn't hold Jonas if something had. Then, a break. The state lab called late on a gray morning and said they'd pulled a partial print from beneath the man's fingernail, a desperate, clumsy attempt at scraping something off. The print matched a name from a report years back, Matthew Rains. Matthew was a local handyman who'd been reported missing after a rowboat accident at the old paper mill slip 7 years earlier. People used to say Matthew drank too much, that he kept to himself. His photograph in the missing persons file showed a man with a cautious smile and a scar on his chin. I recognized from the bar where he'd done work fixing stools. Hannah had once babysat his niece. I remembered the way Matthew would leave a crayon drawing on the bar for her. He'd been gone long enough that the town had folded him into its margins. That discovery should have made us exhale. Instead, it made the sheriff frown deeper. "So he's not a drifter," Frank said. "He's someone from here, which means someone here did this, or someone took him from here." The town presses closer when things like that are possible. Fingers start to point at shadows. There were men at the marina who suddenly seemed longer, quieter. Ron came down with a face like someone carrying an apology he couldn't place. "I've done dives for wrecks," he said in the shop one afternoon, removing a gasket. "People don't always want their business found." He avoided my eyes when he said it. "I keep boxes in lakeside storage. Old gear. Nothing good to hide. Eve." A pattern began to imagine itself in the evidence like something a tide draws. Numbers scratched on a wrist, the missing handyman, the log of old storage units rented and then abandoned. Frank's deputies found a rental agreement in an old file, Unit S23 at Lakeside, rented under a name that matched Matthew's sister who had moved away. The key had been turned in, apparently surrendered. But the ledger showed a second key issued under a different name months before Matthew's disappearance, a name linked to a business that did salvage work along the coast. The circles were tightening. That night, my front door had been jimmied. Not smashed, not enough to wake many neighbors. A small, focused act that said, "We're watching." The bolt had been turned and then left. On my kitchen table was a piece of paper with 3 numbers written in a handwriting that hurt to look at. The numbers matched the ones on the man's wrist. No signature, no note, just 3 digits like a demand or a dare. I called Hannah and she came over without saying much. Her belly pressed against her coat like a small secret. She sat at the table and took my hand. "You should leave," she said simply. "Go somewhere, stay with friends." I told her I couldn't. I told her I had to find Jonas, to find what connected the pier to the storage units to the faces at the bar. I told her I'd keep her safe. She looked at me like I was a reckless promise. The next morning, I walked to the storage yard before dawn, keys in my pocket, the sky a soft, anxious blue. The gate opened with a groan, and my breath fogged in front of me. Most units were locked and anonymous, the metal doors like teeth. Unit S23 was in the back, the number painted crooked, the lock had been cut. Inside, the unit smelled of old canvas, oil, and something metallic. There were crates, an old propeller here, a tarp there, and a plywood chest pushed against the wall. I pried it open slowly and found a ledger inside. Not an official ledger, but scraps of paper, a list of dates, and scrawled names. Beside it lay a yellowed photograph of a man I recognized. Matthew, younger, grinning into the camera. Someone had circled dates in the margin. My hands shook as I thumbed the pages. The ledger contained more than names. There were sketches of the harbor, notes about times when boats left and returned, and in the corner of one page, the same numbers etched into the wrist of the man from the boathouse. Someone had been keeping a record. Someone had been counting. I heard a footstep behind me and turned too quickly. A shape filled the doorway, tall, wrapped in a coat heavy with sea spray. For a breath, I saw the face, and then it was gone into shadow. The shape moved with a purpose that made the hair stand on my arms. "You shouldn't be here," a voice said, low and not unkind. It belonged to someone who expected obedience. I could have run. I could have called out. I didn't, because the shape in the doorway knew where to stand to make questions into traps. "What did you find?" the voice asked. Before I could answer, the person moved away and something glided against the doorframe, a scraping that sounded all too familiar. The hunter smelled like harbor wood and machine oil, and for the first time I understood how small towns can fold the guilt of their past into the tools they use every day. I stepped back toward the light. The ledger clutched like a confession. The person turned and the face slid into the light. It wasn't Ron. It wasn't Frank. It was a man I had seen 100 times at auctions and at the docks, Garrick Stone, owner of Stone Salvage, whose trucks did the heavy, dirty work no one wanted to speak about. His jaw was a stone. His eyes were the color of river scum. He smiled like a man who'd been waiting for a reason to close a book. "You shouldn't be meddling, Evan," he said quietly. "Some things are meant to finish their course." I could smell the harbor on him as if he'd come from a wooden grave. My mouth felt suddenly full of sand. Jonas's face flashed in my head, his laugh, his careless skepticism. If Garrick knew things, if the ledger in my hands tied names to faces, then the harbor had fewer safe corners than I thought. And as Garrick turned away, the light caught the side of his hand, the same 3 numbers tattooed faintly where a watchband might cover skin. Everything slotted into place with a hollow click. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When Garrick turned and I saw that the same 3 numbers were on the side of his hand, the air left my lungs like someone had pulled a plug. I held the ledger like an accusation. He smiled without humor, the kind of smile that belongs to men who have been doing terrible things for a long time and have made a philosophy out of it. "You shouldn't be meddling, Evan," he said again. "You don't know what you've found." "I know enough," I said, and my voice surprised me by not shaking. "You had Matthew. You had him in a unit. You wrote dates and times. You wrote the numbers. Jonas went looking for answers, and now he's gone. How many people are those numbers?" Garrick's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand the work," he said. "We move what needs moving. Sometimes people get in the way." That was the word I hated. Work, used to sanitize something savage. He stepped forward, and I saw the ledger again, the names and the scrawled harbor sketches. There were more dates circled than I cared to count. I thought of Matthew's grin in the photo, the child's shoe in the boathouse, the number on the wrist like a ledger entry. I thought of Jonas's laugh and the way he used to throw his head back when he was about to tell a story. "You bring this to Frank," Garrick said. "You bring anyone here, and you put not just me, but half the harbor on a dock. Think about that before you make a choice." He backed out of the doorway like a predator that had toyed with its prey enough. His truck's light caught the ledger in my hand for a moment, and I copied the circled dates in my head. I had enough. I slammed the storage door and ran for the gate. I called Frank on the way to the sheriff's office. My hands were numb, and my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Frank met me in the lobby with a face I had never seen on him before. Tight, wary, like a man who has had his town handed to him empty. "You found something?" he asked, not waiting for a proper greeting. I told him everything. I gave him Garrick's name and the description of the ledger and the tattoo. Frank listened like he was filing the words inside a safe place. "Stay with Hannah," he said finally, the practicalness of the order cutting the panic into pieces. "I'll move on Garrick and pull the warrant." It didn't happen the way the movies tell it. Garrick didn't go quietly when deputies came to his lot. He was in the salvage yard that night like he'd been expecting a storm. When the deputies moved in, Garrick bolted toward a stack of crates and a rollaway boat sitting on a trailer. Someone shouted. There was a scuffle. I stood in the cold and felt my knees go weak. Then I heard the shout I had been waiting for. A deputy in the title dark saying, "Search the trailer! Search the water!" They found Jonas half submerged in a compartment beneath the rolled boat, tied and gagged, eyes wide and suddenly alive with anger and relief. He was alive because Garrick's plan, for all its cruelty, had slipped on a hinge. Jonas's ribs were bruised and his voice was thin, but when he saw me, he tried to smile and laughed, a small, broken sound. "Took you long enough," he said. They dragged Garrick out in handcuffs. He didn't plead much. He only looked at us like a man who had been interrupted at a job. In the salvage yard, the deputies found evidence. Canvas like the one that had wrapped Matthew, boxes labeled with dates, rope like the one tied around Jonas. Frank's men worked with method and grim efficiency, and for the first time in days, the town had something to hang its hope on. The ledger in my hands went into evidence. The state police showed up faster than I thought they would. The story spread down the line. Matthew Rain's partial print, the numbers, Garrick's salvage business. What the ledger suggested was worse than a single crime. It suggested a system, a way of moving people and making them disappear. The numbers were inventory codes. The dates, the harbor sketches, these were routes and times. Garrick and a half-dozen men who worked for him had been using salvage runs to hide bodies and silence witnesses under the river's long patience. Garrick's trial took months. The town turned inward and then outward. Reporters came and left like migrating birds. There were interviews and forensics, and people who had been silent for years stood up and told what they knew. Some told stories they'd buried out of fear, others because they were ashamed. Ron came forward reluctantly, as did a couple of old hands at the dock who swore they'd been paid to look the other way. The weight of that quiet complicity made what had happened feel broader than any of us had room to hold. Jonas recovered slowly. His laugh stayed crooked for a while, and he slept with the light on for months. Hannah's baby, our small, stubborn miracle, came into the world months later, and everything that was tender in me rallied around that. We had to rethread our lives together. I went back to fixing boats because steel and diesel have a blunt mercy to them. They don't ask to be forgiven. Garrick and 2 accomplices were convicted. The ledger did its quiet work in court. Numbers became names, dates became timelines. The man who had been wrapped in canvas by the pilings, Matthew Rains, was identified finally, after DNA and dogged cross-checking of years-old reports. There were more names. There were apologies made and avoided. There were sentences read in a room that still smelled faintly of old coffee and rubber boots. For all that, the harbor didn't stop being a harbor. It just carried a story now like a hard stone. The thing I learned is this: small towns don't always keep their own secrets because they want to. Sometimes they keep them because keeping them is easier than tearing them open. But you can't bury everything. The lake eventually shows the tally. People who try to balance life on a ledger of missing faces will find one number too many. We found one too many. Sometimes in the dark, when the gulls are quiet and the harbor smells like diesel and rain, I feel the weight of those months. I wake at 2 a.m. with the ledger's paper ghost under my pillow, and I remember Jonas's face when he was brought back to light. I remember Matthew's photograph, his smile like a child's. I remember Garrick's hands, the numbers like a brand. We put locks on things and we leave lights on the pier. Frank keeps a closer eye. Ron keeps to his boat repair and talks less about rescue than he once did. And when the wind makes a sound like something dragging across the wood, I listen. Not because I'm afraid I will find another body, but because the town taught me to always mind the small things. They are maps. This is the end of the story I promised to tell you. How a harbor secret started with a shoe and a scrap of jacket and led us to the ledger and to Garrick Stone's cage. The damage is not undone. It can't be. But some people were remembered, and some of the frightened, silent corners of Muskegon found a voice. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Thomas Grady. I was 34 the night everything changed, October 14th, 2018. I tell this the way an old fisherman tells of a storm. Slow at first so you can feel the wind build in your chest. Muskegon sits on the rim of Lake Michigan like a place that remembers things other towns have forgotten. For me, it was home by accident, a short drive from the highway, a rented upstairs flat above a shop called Blackfin Garage, and a paycheck that paid for coffee and the occasional fishing bait. I wasn't looking for trouble. Trouble, if it exists, tends to find men who keep odd hours and listen too closely to empty places. People in town had their own names for the thin strip of land at the north end of the pier, The beacon docks, the old light, or just the point. The old lighthouse had been decommissioned for years. Kids used to dare each other to go inside. Couples left locks and promises on the railings in summer. In the late fall, when the tourists left and the gulls fattened on driftwood, the point turned quiet in a way that felt like waiting. There were stories: a boat that ran aground with nobody aboard, a hotel room left with the bed still warm, though the guest had vanished. I didn't start with belief in those stories. I started with curiosity and a job that tied me to late-night deliveries. I'd known Logan Pierce since high school. He had a laugh like a train and a bad habit of borrowing my tools and never returning them. He worked a few docks over at Westwind Marine and ran an online forum about old navigation gear. He was the one who convinced me to go down to the point after midnight that October. "Just come with me," he said over the glow of a diner counter, and I said yes, because my apartment felt smaller than usual, and because Logan's projects always sounded like trouble in the right way. There was also Maggie Collins, who ran the bait shop across from the garage. Maggie knew everything the lake forgot: tides, wrecks, what washed up where. She had a soft voice but a steady eye, and when she warned you, you took it. On the morning of the 13th, she'd handed me a cup of coffee and said, "Don't go poking around the old beacon tonight, Tom. Not this time of year." I laughed and told her I wasn't superstitious. Her face didn't change. "That's not superstition," she said. "Just don't go alone. If you do, go with someone you trust." Sheriff Alan Rutledge is the sort of man who has worked the shoreline his whole life. He knows the patterns of boaters and break-ins and the ways people misjudge winter and water. He showed up in one of my memories later, head with tired eyes and a notepad. For now, he was someone we nodded to as he drove past the marina that day, pausing to scan the horizon. The week before the 14th, a few odd things had happened in town that people chalked up to kids or drunks. Doors knocked clean off hinges at the old boathouse, a fishing net strung like a warning across the service road, flashlights found in the dunes with their batteries drained. A headline in the local paper mentioned vandalism at the point, and then moved on to happier things. Most of us kept our lives between the garage and the bait shop and the diner. But nights at the end of October have a way of stretching, and what starts as a trespass becomes a pattern if you let it. Logan texted that evening, "Are you up for a run down to the light?" He had a scanner that picked up strange transmissions whenever storms rolled in. I told him I'd come after I closed up the garage. There's a rhythm to closing up a place: the hiss of air brakes, the clink of keys, the smell of oil and cold metal. I shut the door and thought about Maggie's warning, and then shrugged it off the way men do when they want to be brave or foolish. We met at 11:30. The sky was a slab of black glass, and the lake had the low, slow breathe of a thing not yet decided to rage. Logan had coffee in a thermos and his scanner tucked under his jacket. We drove my truck past the string of shuttered warehouses, through a stretch of birch and scrub where the road narrows, and then the point swung into view. Muddied sand, low dunes, the lighthouse like an old tooth against the horizon. We parked near the old beacon docks, where a wooden sign leaned crooked and a flock of gulls argued with the cold. There were scrap pieces of boat hull here and there, and the smell of salt and diesel. Logan turned on the scanner and said, "You ever hear a signal in the quiet like this?" I told him no, I hadn't. He grinned like a boy and led the way down the planks. Before the main part of my story begins, and forgive me because I know you want the moment, the snap of the story when the air goes thin, I want you to see what it felt like to be a town where the past sits heavy in the sand. There was a barber near the harbor who kept a jar full of rusted keys behind the counter. Everyone in Muskegon had a lock that matched some old story. People had been washed out of their homes by storms here, or had their boats taken by currents nobody could explain. That kind of history sits in the bones of a place. It makes ordinary nights feel like stained glass. Light passes through and changes color. At about 700 words into this telling, because stories are cruel and take their time, like tides, the night altered. We were near the Lighthouse Foundation when the scanner spat something that wasn't static or fisherman's chatter. It was a thin, high note at first, like a dropped tuning fork, then a whisper of syllables that didn't make sense. Logan froze. Hear that? He mouthed. I nodded. The sound didn't belong to the lake or to the wind. We turned toward the light, and maybe 50 yards from the base, something had been hammered into the sand, a line of small wooden stakes, each with a scrap of cloth tied to it. Ragged, weathered, some dark with mud. Who had done this? Who had left a path like a sewn seam along the shore? Logan said nothing. Maggie's warning was a wet thing in my mouth, and I realized like a slow drop down a cold well how alone that strip of beach could make a man feel even standing with someone else. Then the lights on the lighthouse, which had been dead for years, flicked briefly as if someone hit the switch. Not the wide wash of the original lamp, but a narrow, almost private beam that rolled across the dunes and then snapped off. We both saw it. We both heard, at the same time, a sound, the kind of sound you get when something big shifts in a small place. It was like the hinge of the world creaking. I reached for my phone. No signal. Logan's scanner had gone silent, as if whatever had spoken into it had swallowed its voice. I felt the hair at the back of my neck stand up like a fin. This is where I stop for now, because the part that follows is what I wake at night to remember. The figure on the far dune, the way the sand gave underfoot, the smell that was not salt but something older, and the decision to run, to hide, to stay, that men make in a heartbeat and live with for years. I won't rush you into it. The lake remembers everything, and I tell it slowly. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The beam flicked and then died, and when the dark took the point back, it felt like the world had folded a page. Logan and I stood frozen, our breath steaming in the cold. Then, on the lip of the dune, a shape moved. At first I thought it might be a tall gull or a bundle of driftwood caught by the tide, but it was too deliberate. It had the outline of a man, hunched, shoulders wrapped in something that might have been a coat or kelp. He didn't walk so much as slide down the slope, and when he reached the base of the dune, he paused and turned his face toward us. That face was a blank in the dark. Where eyes should have been there were only hollows that caught the scant light and held it like a memory. Logan swallowed hard and swallowed his words. He held up his hand for calm and raised the scanner toward the shape as if noise could uproot it. The device gave a tiny chirp and then nothing. Hello? Logan called, the sound cracking in his throat. Hey, you okay? The figure lifted one hand and made a slow, precise motion toward the stakes and the ragged cloth. It was like a benediction or a command. Behind him, the row of stakes, those little earnest crosses we had almost tripped over, seemed to bristle as if something in the earth tightened. The air went colder, the kind of cold that sits under your skin. Something about the way that figure moved didn't belong to any living person I'd ever known. Old fishermen move with the lake inside them. Kids run like the world will forgive them. This thing moved like a tide, inevitable and patient. Logan took a step forward. He was the kind of man who always took the step forward. We just came to check the beacon, he said. Turned on a light for a laugh. Didn't mean. The figure's mouth opened like an old well. No sound came out at first. It leaned forward, and then, as though our voices had poured into it, it spoke in a voice that wasn't a voice. It was many voices layered thin. Wind over tin, a child's whisper, a radio between stations. They come back, the chorus said. They take. They remember. If I had been a braver man, I might have laughed, might have called out some bravado. Instead, my legs felt like ropes. Logan took another step. He held his flashlight low so the beam would not flare, and the light brushed a hand that hung from the figure's belt. A hand made of wood, carved and cracked, with nails driven through the knuckles and a smear of something dark between them. The knot of the cloth tied to the stake at the figure's feet moved as if a small wind had passed, and the cloth fluttered like a flag. Logan cursed under his breath. Tom, back up. But he didn't. He kept moving forward until he was maybe 10 feet from the dunes and the shape, and I could see the whole figure now. A man the sea had made. Skin like driftwood, hair braided with rope, an old oil skin clinging to him that smelled of salt and decay. His eyes, when the light hit them, had the green of algae. He reached out a hand and touched Logan's shoulder. I should have run then, and I should have yanked Logan back and dragged him screaming to the truck, but something in me was glued to the sand. Logan shuddered where he stood. His face went slack for a breath that seemed too long, his mouth forming words that didn't belong to him. He tried to turn, but his feet were planted like anchors. The figure leaned close and breathed in, and the smell that came off him was not the lake, but something older, iron and old paper, the sweet rot of things left too long in trunks. "Remember," the thing breathed. "Remember the names." Logan's head jerked. He looked at me with eyes that were still Logan's, but not all his. "Tom," he said, and the name sounded like a thin wire being pulled tight. His hand flew to his pocket and he fumbled out his phone. For one stupid second, I thought he'd finally call someone, some cop, some friend. His thumb swiped the screen and the phone lit like a pale insect. He typed with one finger, his movements quick and desperate, and then he folded his hand over the screen and crushed it to his chest like a talisman. "Don't," the figure said, and the voice became like surf through a grate. "Don't dig where the bones sleep." Before I could do anything, before I could run or throw myself between them, the sand under Logan's boots gave. It didn't crumble like weak soil. It sank as if a mouth had opened. His left foot went down. He tried to pull it up, and the sand answered with a hungry, slurping sound. He reached out for me, and I grabbed his wrist with both hands. I pulled. He didn't come. Instead, right below his knee, the sand broke like a trapdoor and swallowed him up to his thigh. His face went pale, his fingers clawing at my jacket. I had both hands on him, and it was like trying to pull a post from the ground. "God, Logan," I yelled. I thought of Maggie's cup of coffee, of the diner where we ate stale pie, of every time I'd left him to fix a motor, and he'd given me that crooked grin. I heaved. The sand came up to his waist, then his chest. He was slipping, pulling with the kind of panic that makes a man look older in a single second. The figure at the dune watched with that empty, patient face, one hand lifting as if blessing the sea. I wasn't strong enough. Logan's shoulders went under the surf of sand and then his head, and for a single terrifying beat, I thought he'd drown like a man in water, lungs filling with grit. He pounded on the sand with both hands. His knuckles went white. Then, with a last animal sound that wasn't quite a word, the sand closed over him and smoothed where he'd been standing. The small wooden stakes along the shore rattled as if somebody had shaken them, and in the hush, I heard only the lake breathing. I remember crawling back on my hands and knees, thinking maybe I'd wake up, thinking maybe it was some cruel trick. My hands were filthy with sand and something else, a smear of red that might have been rust. I tried to call out Logan's name, but my throat was a dry rag. The truck keys were yards away, glittering like a promise, but every time I crawled toward them, my body betrayed me with a kind of slow, stunned numbness. When I finally reached the truck, I drove like a man fleeing a fire. I didn't look back. The beacon was a black tooth on the horizon. Traffic lights at the intersection were the only other things alive in the night. But my mind kept returning to the silence on the beach, to the way the stakes had stood like a small fence, and how, where Logan had been, there was no sign he had existed at all except for an imprint in the sand that the tide would claim by morning. There was no signal on my phone until I reached the main road. Sheriff Rutledge answered in a voice that made the whole thing worse because he believed the world had rules. "Tom?" he asked. I told him what happened, and I heard the shift in his tone, the way a man who has lived the shoreline all his life resists the idea of the sea taking a person in something other than weather. "Stay where you are," he said, and the way he said it made me feel suddenly like a child been admonished. He wasn't sure, and you could hear the gears of a man's mind turning. Missing, runaway, misadventure. He told me to come down to the station and to leave everything as it was. I couldn't. I kept thinking of the stakes and the cloths and the carved hand, and, like an idiot, I went home. I slept fitfully, nightmare after nightmare where the sand moved beneath me like slow hands. At dawn, I walked to the window and saw, on my front stoop, pinned into the dirt with a small, crude stake, a scrap of cloth. It was the same rag I'd seen tied to the stakes at the beach. Mud caked one edge. There was a smear of something dark on it. I did not sleep again that day. I called the sheriff, and this time he came. He walked the beach with me, his boots heavy on the planks, eyes scanning the dunes. He found the line of stakes, but no human prints leading away from them. He found a small circle of scuffed sand where something large had turned, but no footprints. "Maybe Logan ran," he said. "Maybe he wandered in. We find people all the time who get lost by the light. But he didn't find Logan. Not that day, not the next. The town whispered. Maggie closed the bait shop for a week. People left bread and beer cans on the railings as if that might lure something into the open. I kept finding small things around my apartment. A line of salt arranged in a crescent on the windowsill, a scrap of rope on the doormat. Each time I disposed of them, they returned. At night I started to hear it, not the sea exactly, but a pattern in the dark. A soft scraping at the edges of vision, a whisper that sounded suspiciously like my own name. I grew thin with sleep and something else, the knowledge that whatever had its hands on Logan hadn't meant to stop at the beach. And somewhere, in the place that remembers, the beacon stood with a thin light that only turned on when the moon was new. I didn't know then who or what the figure was. I only knew that the town keeps its secrets like a fisherman keeps his best lure. Near the bottom, wrapped in tar and waiting to be pulled up by someone who believes they can take what the lake has already decided is not theirs. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. After Logan vanished into the sand, everything in Muskegon shifted like a shoreline after a storm. Familiar things rearranged, small and sharp. The sheriff's team turned the beach over with shovels and dogs and headlights that made the dunes look like a theatrical set. They found nothing but the stakes and the ragged cloths and an imprint where Logan had been. The television vans never came. The paper ran a short piece about a missing man and a quote from Sheriff Rutledge. No evidence of foul play at this time. Locals whispered and then acted like they hadn't heard. That's the way small towns manage grief. They tuck it into pockets until it either fades or eats them. I tried to live the outside parts of life. Work at the garage, pretend the bolts and bearings and wiring were the only language I spoke. But grief is not a single feeling. It's a geometry that changes the way a person stands. Maggie closed her shop for days and left a jar of coffee out for anyone who came by. She didn't speak much to me, but she washed my hands once, as if removing something that had soaked too deep. Sheriff Rutledge came around again, this time with a photo Logan had given him. Logan standing in front of an old trawler, laughing, eyes bright. Rutledge looked at the picture too long and finally said, "Sometimes people leave town, Tom. People start over in other places." His voice had the tinny defeat of a man trying to believe his own words. I couldn't accept leaving it to maybe. I started to look where the sheriff didn't look. At night, I walked the shoreline with a steel claw and a flashlight, listening for the hollow sound that betrayed sinkholes, for the whisper of lost things. The beach, in daylight, looked ordinary. Gulls, broken ropes, cigarette butts. At night, it held its breath. 2 nights after Logan disappeared, I met Evelyn Blake at the Muskegon Historical Society. Evelyn ran the place with the ferocity of someone who loved name lists and dates. She had hair like steel wool and an office stuffed with boxes. I went there because Maggie had suggested it. "If someone's been taking the old bones, the books will tell us why," she said. Evelyn listened to my story like a woman reading the margins of a book and finding a line that had been underlined. "You're not the first to see stakes," she told me, and when she said it, her hands went to the edge of the table as if holding back a tide. "These things, they're markers. People have used them for years up and down the lakes to remember the lost, to warn, to claim. Sometimes they're a charm. Sometimes they're an accusation." She pulled out a brittle ledger bound in leather. Its pages were mapped with pencil marks and ink, names, dates, short notes. "Start here," she said, tapping a page from the late 1800s. The ledger recorded boats lost, storms named, the names of men who did not come home. Some names had crosses by them, some had columns of tally marks. At the bottom of one page, scrawled in a shaky hand, was the name of a lighthouse keeper, Jebediah Crow, keeper until 1895. A note beside his name read, "Keeper buried himself with the beacon after the Marigold ran, cargo of bones and bells." "Marigold?" I asked. "A freighter that came in one winter and never left whole," Evelyn said. "The town closed ranks for a while. People died. Men were blamed. Jebediah kept a watch in the light, and then he stopped. Some say he was cursed. Some say he found something in the hull and couldn't bear to leave it where it might be taken. That ledger is full of the little things towns keep to not forget." My fingers found a later page dated 1962. A small note had been added in a different hand. Patterns repeat. Scratchy, like the writer had been too tired to finish. Names in the ledger matched a map Evelyn rolled out on the table. Crosses where crew had gone down, where bodies were found, where people had been swallowed by the shoreline. The map had a neat circle around the point. "What are those stakes?" I asked. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "When families mark graves, they leave something," she said. "Not all who are taken are known. The sea keeps names, Tom. Maybe whoever tends the light is trying to keep the tally from growing, or trying to find a balance. Or maybe it's something else entirely." That night, I dreamed of the marigold. Its name tasted of iron. I saw men stacked like firewood in its belly and a lamp that blinked in the hold like a slow eye. When I woke, my pockets held sand that wasn't mine. Word started drifting from people who said they'd found things in their yards. A fish bone threaded with a ring, a child's shoe in the attic that none of them remembered buying. A fisherman near the west docks swore he hauled up a length of chain with a rusted locket tied to it. Inside was a picture of a man with Logan's nose. He swore he didn't want the trouble and hid it in his boat. The town that avoided the television vans also cherished its silence about certain finds. One evening, Sheriff Rutledge knocked on my door. He looked older. "We pulled some records," he said. "There's been 3 disappearances along this stretch in the last century that share a detail." He kept his voice low. All of them had people who'd been seen near the beacon. All of them had stakes put into the sand. He handed me a photocopy from a patrol log of a missing man's report from 1979. Someone had scribbled beside it, "Beacon Watch Continued." The implication was a kind of deliberate negligence, a history of people going missing where the light remembered them. Rutledge's eyes lingered on me, as if he wanted to ask if I had done something or if I knew something he couldn't allow himself to know. In the end, he only said, "Stay away from the point at night," and left me with the warning ringing like a bell. Warnings are a kind of prayer. They assume that saying something aloud keeps it held back by etiquette. I didn't heed it. The need to find Logan had burrowed into me and wouldn't let go. On the 4th night, I went back to the beach. I took neither rope nor flashlight, just a small notebook and the courage of a man who has nothing left to lose. The stakes were there again, no matter how many times Sheriff Rutledge swore he would remove them. They stood in a crooked line like teeth. I followed them, my footsteps careful so as not to ruin any print that wasn't mine. At the very end of the row, closer to the base of the lighthouse than I had been the first time, I found something tucked under a scrap of cloth. A small brass watch, half filled with sand. Its face was cracked, and the hands were frozen at 11:30. Also, under the watch, a single coin stamped with a year I did not recognize, and pressed to it like a note, a single line handwritten in a shaky hand. "Remember the names, or they will remember you." I put the watch in my pocket, and for the first time since that night, I felt a direction. Whatever the light was, keeper, curse, see, it had a ledger. It asked to be read. I didn't yet know whether reading it would free Logan or call the thing tighter to me, but I knew I had to try. I didn't tell the sheriff about the watch. I did tell Evelyn. She only said, "If it's asking you to remember, perhaps it's asking for witness. Names spoken are not so easily taken." So I planned. I would go back to the point when the moon hid itself, and I would speak names aloud. I would read from the ledger Evelyn had shown me, and I would say, in the wrongness of the dark, what the sea had eroded from memory. Whether that would be salvation or a summons, I did not know. But the alternative, staying quiet while Logan was a patch of sand and a missing face, seemed worse. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I took the ledger, the brass watch ticking like a small borrowed heart in my pocket, and walked toward the point under a moon that had the nerve to hide behind cloud. Evelyn said little when I showed her what I'd found. She only pressed a hand to the cover as if it was an old wound. Maggie left out a thermos and a sandwich she wouldn't eat herself. Sheriff Rutledge offered to stand watch on the road. His presence was, for all its solidity, a thin rope of comfort that I could snap with my next breath. "Say names like you mean them," Evelyn told me. "Say them clear. The sea listens to memory." Her voice was dry as driftwood. She wouldn't come with me. None of them would. They had their lives and their rules, and whatever rules governed the point were not rules they wanted to break. I walked the planks alone. The stakes had multiplied, a crooked fence that seemed to grow while I watched. Ragged cloth flapped like pale tongues, and the cracked watch in my hand ticked stubbornly at 11:30. Logan's watch, stopping where the sand had taken him. My breath came out in small ghosts. I thought of Logan's grin and his bad jokes, and the way he kept my secrets the same way he hoarded spare O-rings, like treasures. When I reached the base of the lighthouse, the air changed the way a room changes when someone closes the door. Sound pinched off. The scanner Logan once carried made a tiny, impossible chirp in my mind, like a filed nail on glass. From the shadow of the stone foundation, the figure came, not running now, but walking with the same patience as an undertow. The oilskin hung from him the way old sea cloth hangs from hooks after a long season. Thomas Grady, the thing said. The voice was the chorus of gulls and a bell underwater. It knew my name, though I'd not spoken it aloud. I swallowed and forced the ledger into my hands like a book of prayers. My palms were slick. I read the first name, not loud, not a show. I let the syllables fall into the night, Jebediah Crow. The wind took it and held it, and I felt the stakes tremble like soldiers at attention. A scrap of cloth untied itself and drifted away. The lighthouse's private beam blinked without human hand and swept the sand in a slow ritual. I read name after name. Some were old, ink faded. Some were names that smelled of new grief. Each name slipped into the dark, and the sea answered with a small shifting, like something laying down. I thought of what Evelyn said. The ledger demanded witness. Memory, once spoken, was harder to swallow. When I reached Logan's name, my voice broke. I had to clear my throat and start again. Logan Pierce. The figure's head tilted. It moved closer, and in the hush I heard a sound I had not heard since the night Logan sank. A thump like something turning over in mud. The sand at the figure's feet parted, and a hand came up, slick and pale with sea smell, and then another. Logan slid himself out of the sand as if he were rising from a shallow grave. His clothes were clotted with grit and his hair braided with bits of rope. He looked like the man who had promised to bail me out of trouble and then vanished. And he didn't look like him at all. Tom, Logan said, and the breath that carried his name was paper thin. His eyes were brighter than they had any right to be. He smiled with a kindness that hurt. You remembered me. I reached for him like a man reaching for a lifeline. He let me touch his arm, and my hand sank into a patch of cold that wasn't quite skin. He smelled of iron and old stories. For a wild second, I thought we'd haul each other back to the truck and that everything would be as ridiculous and ordinary as the garage with its sockets and oil stains. Then the figure spoke in a voice like an orchestra of things breaking. They come, it said. They come because names are thin. They come when the ledger thins and the balance tilts. Remembering binds them, forgetting frees them. It turned its driftwood face toward Logan, and there was a tenderness there that didn't belong to monsters. He kept one too many names, Keeper. A ledger must be tended. A ledger will take its due. Logan looked at me as though he contemplated a joke he could not finish. Tom, he whispered, they need a hand. Not to hurt, to keep the others safe. The ledger felt heavy in my hands, as if it had weight added to it by the names themselves. I thought then of all the missing faces that went from town to imprint and sand to rumor. I thought of Sheriff Rutledge's eyes and Maggie's small, worried hands. The figure, the keeper, the sea's clerk, offered no malice, only a function. The sea demanded accounting. What do you mean? I asked. My voice was small. Ledger must be kept, it said. A name in the book walks the line. A name given becomes tether. A tether holds the drift. It pointed with a finger that looked carved. You brought witness. You named them. You may bind them, or you may be bound. Logan sank to his knees. For a moment he seemed light as driftwood, as if the sea's mantle had not yet settled over him. He held out the brass watch I had kept in my pocket. I was there, Tom, he said. Not all the way gone. They keep us. But we remember. If you take my place, they'll let me walk the town again. I'll be different, but I'll be free from the dark. The choice burned hotter than any storm wind. I imagined Logan at the diner, Maggie laughing as she lessened her scowl, the sheriff's eyes easing. I imagined him waking from some wrong dream and coming home. The ledger sat between us, patient and uncaring. Its pages were blank where a fresh name might be written. There's always a price, Evelyn had said in my memory. The The sea's accounting doesn't bargain, it takes. How? I asked. Logan gripped my hand. His fingers were cool. You say the names, he said. Then you write the one who will stand in the ledger's place. It will bind them. It will also bind the one who writes. I'm sorry, Tom. In the end, there was no debate. What else was there? To stand aside and let Logan be a myth in the sand felt like traitorship. I had learned in the garage that good metal sometimes takes a permanent set. A wrench can be bent once and kept that way. I took the pen from my pocket, a pen I'd stolen from the sheriff's office because it felt official, and wrote my name in a clumsy hand on the ledger's fresh page. Thomas Grady, October 14, 2018. The moment the ink dried, a wind rose that smelled of cold pennies. The stakes hummed and a dozen cloths fluttered themselves, tying into neat knots. Logan let out a sound, not quite a laugh, and the light on the lighthouse brightened for a single blessed sweep. He stood and he was himself, and he was not. He leaned into me and kissed my cheek like a brother who had come home from war. Go, he said. Live. Remember the names, Tom. Tell them the ledger takes what it must. Tell them to feed it memory. It wants names, not souls. It wants to remember. I tried to step away, but the sea's hand, patient and inevitable, took me. It wasn't a violent thing. It was like a tide pulling a rock into deeper water. I felt myself loosen at the seams and slide. My hand closed on Logan for a second, and then on the ledger, and then I was beneath the sand as he'd been, seeing the world overhead like a glassy ceiling where gulls traced lazy questions. They pulled me up the next morning. Sheriff Rutledge and 2 of his deputies had found me kneeling at the edge of the plaque of sand, eyes wet but alive. I had only vague memories of standing under that thin lighthouse beam and of Logan laughing as if we'd won some small victory. Logan walked into town with a slow gait. He was quieter, and he kept his hands to himself. He opened his mouth and told stories in the diner about tides and small miracles, and people nodded. He married the ordinary again in small performance, and the town slept a little easier. As for me, I sometimes go down at night and stand at the edge of the boardwalk and watch a man who looks like Logan lift his coffee to his lips and smile at the sun. I am not gone completely. The ledger is heavy in my mind like an unremoved anchor. Names come to me in dreams and I speak them aloud, and the sand answers with soft accommodation. People sometimes thank me without knowing why. If you walk the point in late October and you find a row of stakes and cloths, do not call them superstitions. Remember them. Say a name if you know one. Call it out in the dark so the ledger hears and so it will not come to ask again. Some debts we pay with stories. Some we pay with ourselves. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Lucas Grayson. I'm 32 years old, and this happened on October 17th, 2019. I wasn't born in Muskegon, but I'd found a way to make the place mine. A 2-bedroom bungalow 3 blocks from the lakeshore. A battered pickup truck with a dent on the driver's side door that matched the dent in my pride. And a small circle of people who kept me steady when the rest of the world felt unmoored. People here moved slow in autumn. The wind off Lake Michigan softened faces and sharpened stories. The town had its rhythms. Fishermen hauling in perch at dawn, the paper boat tours in summer, kids daring each other to jump from the old pier, and the quiet church bells on Sunday. I worked as a mechanic at a shop on Norton Avenue, sweating under hoods and listening to the radio between grease-smeared hands. Practical things, measured things. I liked schedules. I liked tangible problems that could be fixed with elbow grease and care. There were 4 people I trusted enough to call when the world seemed a little less sensible. Mara, who ran the coffee counter at Cedar and Salt and knew the exact moment I'd need another shot of espresso. Eli Vargas, my childhood friend from the East Side who still carried a laugh big enough to fill a room. Sheriff Tom Whitaker, a man whose hands were as comfortable with a steering wheel as they were with the law. And my sister Anna, who lived 2 counties over and called every couple of nights to remind me I owed her laundry detergent. Names here had stories attached. Not because people were dramatic, but because in a lake town, everyone had watched someone else grow. You couldn't hide much when the seasons changed and the dunes shifted and everyone bought loaves of bread from the same bakery. Muskegon has edges that catch you. There are boardwalks that rattle in the wind, alleys with murals that tell older, complicated tales, and a stretch of dunes the locals called Crescent Hollow. Crescent Hollow isn't on tourist brochures. It sits between a municipal golf course and a run of forgotten summer houses, a place where sand gathers and people go to scatter and remember. In daylight, it's beautiful. Tall grasses waving like slow applause, water that cracks sky into two, sunsets that look like burned postcards. At night, the dunes close their ranks, and the same wind that was gentle by day becomes something else entirely, an old, low voice that moves through the grass and makes the skin of your arms stand at attention. I had my own small rituals. Thursdays, I'd close the shop late, pull into the parking lot behind Mara's cafe, and we would sit on the stoop and talk about nonsense until closing time. Eli would come by some nights with a six-pack and a new idea for a side hustle. We were the kind of friends who could joke about forever and mean it. It felt safe. But the town, like a lake in September, held undercurrents. People left their lights on more in October. They locked basement doors they had never bothered with in July. The sheriff's office put a laminated sheet on the community board about a rash of car break-ins, and we all nodded like we were suddenly older and wiser. Small things. Hard to make a story from. There were rumors too, of course. Every town has them. Old tales that wobble on the edge between the plausible and the impossible. Around Muskegon, people told quieter ones. The story of the boat that ran aground in the fog decades ago, the house on Breakwater Road where no one had lived since a fire, and the whisper about the man who used to walk the pier at night, humming to himself until he didn't. I listened to those stories not because I believed every word, but because stories are how people keep count of moments that matter. We repeat them and they become a map. That map led, in small ways, to the night everything tilted. Before that October evening, I had been careful, the kind of careful that comes from being responsible to others. Paying my sister's electricity share when she was short, going to Mara's opening night for a gallery show, promising Eli I'd help him with a van conversion the following Saturday. The life I had built was ordinary and honest, and filled with the sort of details that make you think you are safe. On the day itself, the sky was the heavy gray of late fall promise. I closed shop around 6, wiped my hands, and told Mara I'd meet her and Eli by the lake after she closed. Just to walk, I said, though I wanted the espresso that made my chest hum. The air had that metallic edge, the kind you get before a storm or when the lake decides to change its mind about being calm. Mara handed me a to-go cup and pressed an extra sleeve into my palm. Eli arrived at 7, grinning like he had a secret. I found a place, he said, and his eyes were the kind that turned small details into big plans. He loved mystery the way other people loved yard work. We met at the foot of Crescent Hollow, where the sand met the boardwalk. The lights of the pier were on but distant, and a fog sat low like a mood you couldn't name. There were only a handful of people out. 2 couples walking dogs, a man at the far end of the pier staring at the water. We walked without much talk at first, because sometimes silence is a kind of language. Eli talked about a van conversion again, Mara about a new pastry recipe, and I listened, rolling the cup between my palms to keep them warm. We didn't plan for anything unusual. We certainly didn't plan for what happened next. It was after the 2 of us, Mara had turned back with a promise to be home by 9, had walked the long stretch toward the lighthouse replica that people used as a landmark. The beach narrowed here, and the dunes looked like sleeping beasts. The wind had learned a new tone, higher and more pinched, and my jacket felt suddenly thin. As we reached the base of a small incline that led up to a service road, Eli slowed. He frowned at something on the sand. At first I thought it was a piece of driftwood. Then I saw the print. 2 boots, pressed into the sand, pointing toward the water, too close to the edge for comfort. They were fresh, edges still soft, and there were drag marks between them like something had been pulled. I don't know why my breath tightened like that. Maybe because we both knew the tide had been low a few hours earlier, and those prints couldn't have been old, or because the air seemed to drop a degree. Eli bent and ran his finger along the inner curve of one print, as if he could read it like a palm. "That's not good," he said, and the laugh that should have followed didn't come. We followed the prints, careful and ridiculous all at once, like kids following a set of rules in a dare. The prince led toward the pier and then stopped abruptly, as if whatever made them had vanished into the night. But where the prince ended, there was a glint, a small piece of something that had snagged sand and salt water, half buried and catching the street lamp light like a promise. It was a ring, simple, the kind you buy at a pawn shop or a pier sale. Cold metal, a tiny scratch. The main story, the part that knocks your breath and rearranges the way you measure time, began then, but that is for another part of this telling. For now, know the town, the names, the weather, and the way the dunes hold secrets like small, patient things. Know that ordinary nights can fold into terrible ones without an obvious seam. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The ring fit into the hollow of my palm like a small, impossible thing, ordinary metal carrying an accusation. Eli and I stared at it for a long second, the surf and the fog doing their own soft work around us. I slipped it into my jacket pocket because it felt wrong to leave it in the sand like a promise to someone else, and because at the time, the pocket felt like the only place I had a right to put things I wanted to protect. We walked back toward town with the ring between us, in silence that had weight. Eli's usual jokes stuck in his throat. I could feel him cataloging possibilities the way he inventoried parts at the shop. We tried the sensible things first. I called Sheriff Whitaker and told him what we'd found. Mara texted to check in and then arrived anyway, flashlight in hand, the smear of flour still on her cheek from the day's baking. Tom showed up with Deputy Rios not long after. Tom's face closed into a kind of focused calm the moment he saw the ring. "Keep to your stories," he said softly, and then he asked questions with the patient rhythm of someone who knows that truth comes out in details. They combed the beach with equipment that felt theatrical in the smallness of it. Torches cutting through the fog, a search dog that nosed at the sand and barked at a slanted driftwood pile, Tom sketching notes on a clipboard the way a priest scribbles lines in a ledger. The ring was bagged and labeled evidence. They took our statements and radios crackled like small animals. There was a tiredness in Tom's voice when he spoke of other calls. A person reported missing in a neighboring county a week ago, boats found bobbing empty farther up the shoreline, but nothing that tied neatly to the ring. "We don't know yet," he said, "but we check everything." We all went home under a sky that felt like a held breath. I remember thinking the ordinary things, the light on the pier, the hum of the refrigerator, the way Mara's coffee cup sat on her counter, were fragile things now, things that could be overturned. I couldn't sleep. I kept reaching for the ring in my pocket out of some ridiculous notion that I might feel connected to the person it had belonged to, that a small weight of metal could confess something about a life. 2 nights later, someone tried to take it back. It began with noises outside my house. Not the usual scrabble of raccoons or the sigh of tires on Norton Avenue, but a slow, deliberate scraping like metal on metal. I was awake, and for a minute I thought it was my imagination. Then a light came on down the street. I looked out and saw a silhouette cross the lawn across from mine. My truck, that old dented pickup, had a new mark on the passenger door, a shallow scrape exposing bare metal. It hadn't been there the night before. And on my porch was a note folded into itself and tucked under the mat. The note made my chest go very tight. It wasn't a demand as much as a question. "Why did you take it?" The letters were blocky, hurried, but the ink was steady. No signature, no explanation. I called Tom. He came over right away with his brow heavy and his hands in his pockets. "We're getting reports," he said. "Other folks have seen men hanging around the piers. A woman in the East End says someone tried to pry open her son's shed. Keep the ring on you, Lucas, and keep your doors locked." "Why me?" I asked. Tom's jaw worked. "Because you picked it up. Because you live here. Because sometimes scary things pick a pattern, and then they pick people who cross them." That phrasing, the way he made it ordinary, was worse than anything. It made the pattern feel like a lung working on its own. Over the next days, the town shifted around us. The bakery closed an hour early. Mara started locking up when the sun was still warm. Eli buzzed the van with plans to leave town for a weekend and then canceled. We all tried to pretend we were fine, but our voices were careful, as if we were walking around a room with a sleeping animal. I kept the ring tucked against my chest in a small leather box. Tom had given me to keep it safe in evidence. I thought that if I held it, if I didn't let it go, then the thing it represented wouldn't be able to reach me. Of course, that was nonsense. Things don't respect our wishes. One night, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't know. The line was quiet when I answered, just a soft scrape and then breathing. "You shouldn't have taken it," a voice said finally, as if delivering a weather report. I tried to keep myself calm. I told the dispatcher at the station who logged it and promised to trace the call. But traces are often slow, and promises are the sort of thing people make to survive the moment. I started noticing small intrusions. Footprints in the soft dirt near my driveway, a cigarette butt in the gutter that hadn't been there before, the soft vibration of a car idling down the block at 2 a.m, then moving on. Once, I woke to find the flashlight on the kitchen table gone and the back door ajar. Nothing taken but the light, which felt less like theft and more like a message. We can be where you sleep. Eli argued I should hand the ring over, that evidence might be safer back at the station. Mara wanted me to disappear for a while, to crash on her couch at the cafe and pretend the town had swallowed me up. Tom's advice was always procedural. Document, report, keep your head down. But none of those things quieted the way my heartbeat picked up when the wind came in from the lake. Each time I thought about the person who'd worn that ring, their hands, their life, the way they may have argued with someone and left the pier that night, the town felt more like a place stitched together with thin thread. Driven by something between curiosity and guilt, I went back to Crescent Hollow alone. I told myself it was to help, to look for anything the sheriff might have missed. The dunes under the moon were a different country. The boardwalk creaked like a memory. I followed the line of footprints I'd seen with Eli, the prints we had assumed pointed toward the water. Only now their pattern was different. They led away from the pier and up into the scrub behind the houses, toward the service road where people kept their winter gear and old boats. That was when I heard the humming. It was a low, tuneless sound, like someone practicing a lullaby badly and obsessively. The sound made your skull feel full. The hairs on my arms rose. The hillside seemed to lean in. I could make out a figure beyond the fence line. A man, hunched against the wind, moving with the slow deliberateness of someone accustomed to hiding. For a breath, I thought about running back to my truck, but something, stubbornness perhaps, or the foolish belief that I could help, pulled me forward. I stepped into the scrub. The humming stopped. I shouldn't have been surprised, but the figure turned. We were close enough that I could see the way the moonlight caught his cheekbones, the way his jaw worked. He wasn't old. He didn't look like the man from the pier I'd heard rumors about. He was too ordinary, the kind of face you might pass on a highway and never remember. His eyes, though, when they found me, were a pale, flat thing like a lake in December. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, and the voice belonged to the man who had called my phone 2 nights earlier. His hand brushed a pocket, and for a horrible second I thought of the ring. My palm went to the small leather box in my jacket and found only the small weight of paper and lint. The box was gone. He smiled then, and it was almost friendly. "You found something that was meant to be left," he said. "You should have left it alone." I moved as if to take a step back, but my heel sank into the sand and my shoulder clipped a low branch. He did not move to chase me. He just watched, and the watching felt like a decision being made. Later, when I told Tom, I would say the man stalked away. When I told Eli and Mara, I would say I'd lost the ring at some point and someone had taken it. When I told Anna, I tried to make light, to keep her from worrying. But the truth lived in the way he smiled and the way the dunes swallowed him like a hand closing. That night, we all slept badly, and the town murmured in waves of uneasy gossip. The ring was gone. Someone had taken it back, and in taking it, had left a new kind of silence. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. After the ring disappeared, something in me shifted from fear to a kind of reckoning. Fear is small and quick. Reckoning is long and methodical. I stopped pretending I could sleep my way through it. I stopped pretending it was enough to hand things over to Tom and wait for him to solve the puzzle. I started looking for patterns. The sheriff's office was helpful in the way a storm is helpful. It showed up when it wanted to and left you with wet shoes. Tom was distracted with calls and reports from neighboring towns, but he still made time to take my questions seriously. He pulled out a thin file one afternoon in his cramped office and laid it on the desk like a confession. "There's been someone who likes to collect," he said, the words like a dull instrument. The file had names and dates and little notations in margins. Missing person, later found alive but shaken, items returned to family, a burned house. One of the pages had a grainy photo clipped to it, a young man with a shock of dark hair and a laugh that reached his eyes. A name was written beneath: Gavin Thorne. Missing since September 2016. Gavin's file had the ring listed as one of the belongings reported missing the night he disappeared. When I saw the picture, there was a cold, tiny recognition like a shadow that didn't belong to me. The ring felt suddenly enormous, not because of what it was, but because of whom it once belonged to. I thought of the pale-eyed man at the scrub and the way he had watched me like someone noting a chess move. It was no longer a random hazard of the beach. It was a thread. I spent nights in the library, tracing names in old articles, flipping through yellowed clippings that smelled like memory. The town's history had scars nobody advertised: a boathouse fire in '88, a child who vanished for 3 days in '97 and came home with a story he wouldn't tell, a fisherman found asleep in his boat with the motor running in '02. The patterns were messy, but present, something that picked at people in small ways for years. The ring, I realized, did not belong to an isolated mystery. It belonged to a habit. I set up a small plan that felt foolish and necessary. I borrowed a camera from Eli, who grumbled but obeyed when I insisted. I started doing the small, boring detective work that people in stories never show, driving down streets at odd hours, taking notes, matching names to faces, asking questions in coffee shops until Mara's patience wore thin, and she started sliding me extra croissants to keep me from talking too much. Beatrice at the library, a woman who wore cardigans like armor, put photos in my hands and offered me a list of people who had once reported things missing and later found them in weird places. She did not look surprised when I told her about the hummed lullaby and the pale eyes. "People repeat what they know," she said, which is a kind way of saying monsters find patterns. 2 weeks after the ring vanished, I found something that made all the late nights worthwhile. It wasn't the ring, not yet, but it was a place tied to the same quiet story. An old boathouse on the far side of the inlet, one that had been barred for years, had a small section of slats pried loose. Inside, someone had made a mess of things: small boxes, cloth-wrapped objects, Polaroids pinned like a Sullivan's list to a nail. I took pictures through the slats and my stomach folded into a map of ice. There were trinkets from people who'd been in the papers years ago, a watch with a crack across the face, a pendant with an initial, a shoelace knotted in a way I had seen before at a crime scene in a TV show. And there, half buried under a stack of damp newspapers, was something metallic flashing like a guilty grin. I could see the edge of a band, familiar and small. I called Tom and told him where to look. He said he'd get men there. He said he would. But hours can be a treacherous friend, and I could not sit still for them. I wanted to be the one who took it back, who found proof that the town's uneasy history had a face. Stubbornness is a kind of courage, and it is often rewarded in stories with terrible consequences. That night, I went back alone. The inlet smelled of rot and salt and old things that had been left to finish their stories. My shoes sank into mud. My throat felt paper thin. I slipped within reach of the boathouse and pried the slat wider. The camera was on, battery humming like a heart. The Polaroids were even stranger close up. There were faces I recognized from faded newspaper columns, dates scrawled in a hand that took itself too seriously. The metallic glint was gone when I pushed further inside, but the room offered up other evidence. A small shrine of sorts, little offerings arranged with the care of someone who believed they were preserving more than objects. A soft scrape made me freeze. Someone else was in the dark with me. I told myself I could leave before the person noticed. I told myself a lot of practical lies. The scrape became breath. A shadow shifted along the doorway, and the hush of the night turned into a tight animal sound in my chest. I saw a hand reach for the boxes, for the Polaroids, and I felt, absurdly, possessive. When the hand turned, I recognized the sleeve, the familiar slouch of the man who had stopped humming in the scrub, the pale-eyed face that had watched me dissolve like paper in rain. He moved like he knew the place, like he'd been tending the shrine all along. "You're persistent," he said, and his voice was the same neutral thing it had been before. There was no menace in it, and that was worse. Men who are dangerous often look ordinary. That's the point. "I called this in," I said, my voice too loud in the quiet. "Tom, You called a lot of things," the man said. He turned slowly, and the moonlight caught a scar at the corner of his mouth, a thin silver line that suggested other times. He stepped closer with the casualness of someone offering conversation. "You shouldn't have taken things that don't belong to you, Lucas." My name in his mouth was a small, intimate menace. My hand went to my jacket out of habit and found only lint and the ghost of a leather box. He smiled in a way that might have been kind if there were different teeth behind it. "You always thought you were careful," he said. "Carefulness is charming." I started to back out toward the doorway. He didn't stop me. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a rag folded with the ritualistic slowness of someone who has rehearsed this gesture many times. There are things I've read in books and seen in movies about not struggling, about bargaining for breath. None of that mattered once the rag touched my face. My vision narrowed to a point the size of the moon, and it was full of his pale eyes, patient and indifferent. I remember thinking, absurdly, about Mara's flower still on her cheek, about Eli's laugh, about the way Lake Michigan looks like it never keeps secrets, and then realized it did. When I woke, there was cold water on my face, and the sky was the pale blue of early morning. I was in a small room that smelled of dust and old wood and other people's lives. My wrists were bare. The camera was nowhere. The Polaroids were gone. The only thing on the table beside me was a small stone with a name etched into it, Gavin Thorne, and an instruction carved not in letters but in the way the world turns. You were not supposed to find what belonged to us. The door to the room opened in the next moment, and a shadow filled the frame, the pale eyes smiling like they belonged to a man with a ledger. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him with a sound like a box being closed. "Welcome back," he said. "You found more than you planned, Lucas. Now we can talk." My mouth was dry. I could feel the blood in my ears like a drum. This was the part of the story where the town held its breath and the pieces realigned. I had found the shrine. I had found the thread. And I had walked, willingly or not, into its hand. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When he shut the door, the room felt suddenly smaller, like the whole town had been folded and tucked into one corner of the world and left to cool. The man with the pale eyes sat across from me at a table that smelled of old tea and dust. He poured water into a chipped mug like a host who had learned how to be gentle on purpose. "You made a mess," he said, and the way he said it made the word mean everything and nothing. He called himself Marcus Vale. He did not volunteer much beyond that. He preferred names he had invented for himself when strangers were around. His real name, he said, wasn't important. What he wanted to talk about was the things I had touched. The ring, the Polaroids, the tiny scraps that made a person's life legible. He spoke about memory like a religion. "People vanish," he said, as if stating a weather fact. "They get pulled out of the frame. I keep pieces of them so they're not lost." There was horror in the coding of civility he used. He told me about shelves he had built, each one a room of memories. Buttons, watches, notes folded into corners. Each object had a name scratched on a stone beside it. Gavin Thorne was one of them. Gavin had argued with friends, he said. Gavin had walked the pier at night and never come home. Marcus's voice was flat when he described it, but his hands were precise when he pointed to a Polaroid with Gavin's face. He liked the water," Marcus said, as if pronouncing an explanation. I tried to be practical while my brain recited the list of things people do in stories when they are cornered. Flatter, bargain, run, strike. I tried to sound reasonable. I tried to keep my hands steady. Mostly, I listened and waited for a sliver of opportunity. I had seen the boathouse slats. I knew the way to the window I had climbed through. I knew the service road and how the tide made the inlet impassable at certain hours. I counted those details like a prisoner counts tiles. Outside, things were moving without me. Mara had not stopped looking. She had a stubbornness that was practical and small, the kind of stubbornness that takes a key and keeps turning it until something opens. Eli had his own version of stubbornness. He had torn through town asking questions, his voice growing louder and sloppier with each refusal. Tom had taken my lead seriously and had circled the inlet with deputies. He had people who remembered faces and cameras that looked at parking lots for hours. Anna refused to leave the sheriff to his paperwork. She sat in his office and drew concentric circles on a pad where she wrote down every place I'd mentioned in the last month. Tom's break came from an unglamorous place, a thermal camera from a lakeside store that had been donated for search and rescue. A clerk remembered Eli's van idling days earlier and thought of the license plate they'd photographed. The boathouse had been seen on a utility cam that night, a shadow slinking across the inlet. The image was grainy, but enough. A figure with my jacket, a figure carrying a bulky bag. Tom put two and two together with the fierce economy of a man who knows how to make a town respond. They moved quietly and swiftly at dawn. Deputies flanked the boathouse while Tom called through a megaphone. "This is the sheriff's office. Come out with your hands where we can see them!" For a breath, I thought maybe he wouldn't answer, that perhaps the man with the pale eyes had become myth enough to slip away. Then a shadow moved at the door, and the metal clanged as it opened. Inside the room, Marcus stood with a calm that made my chest squeeze. He had a small knife in his hand for a second and then dropped it like a petulant child set aside. "You think you can take my collection?" he asked Tom, and for the first time his voice broke with something like rage. Tom stepped forward with the patience of a long road. He spoke the way he always had, simple, precise. "Marcus Vale," Tom said, "you are under arrest for kidnapping and unlawful restraint. Hands where we can see them." There was a flurry, the way arrests look in real life. Neither cinematic nor neat. Marcus tried to bargain, tried to explain that he was saving people, that he only took things that people had already lost. But the deputies had their training, and the town had its own thin, patient laws. They handcuffed him, and the room suddenly felt too large, as if the air that had been held by one man could not be contained. What came after was slower and more fragile. Inside the boathouse's inner rooms, deputies found more than trinkets. They found 3 other people who had been taken and kept alive, frightened, confused, but alive. A woman from a neighboring town who had been missing for weeks, a college kid who had disappeared after a bonfire, and Gavin Thorne. Gavin was thinner than his photo in the file suggested. When they brought him outside into the thin light, he blinked as if remembering what bright things were. He looked at me, and for a moment neither of us could do anything but breathe. He said my name like it was a finishing of a sentence. "You found something I lost," he told me. His voice was a collection of echoes. The ring, the small metal circle that had started this, was among the things on a shelf labeled with my initials, because Marcus liked the idea of me as an intruder who had been brought into his parlor of keepsakes. Tom handed it back to me like an apology. Gavin took it from my hand with fingers that trembled and slid it onto his own like a small act of rejoining. Marcus's arraignment was a slow, ugly thing. Details in court painted him as meticulous and convinced of his righteousness. Psych evaluations said he believed he was rescuing people from their fates by stealing their moments and setting them on a shelf where he could visit them. They spoke of delusions and a long trail of odd complaints stitched into his past. The town wanted the simplest narrative. There was a villain, and he was behind bars. The legal system offered a more complicated one. There were questions of culpability and competence, and how to keep people safe when the law meets someone who has been collecting sorrow like a hobby. For me, the aftermath was about small acts stacked together. Mara baked an impossibly sweet pie and left it on my porch with a note that said, "In the bluntness only friends use, don't pretend you didn't sleep at my place for a week." Eli stayed with me for 3 nights and insisted I let him bolt my doors the way a child insists on putting a bandage on a scrape. Anna organized fundraisers for the families who had been shaken loose by Marcus's years of taking. Gavin went home slowly, with the ring on his hand and a lot of help. The town stitched itself back together in its own quiet way. People began to walk the pier again, though some were slower, footfalls measured. There were memorials and vigils for the parts that couldn't be returned. Time stolen, pieces of life that had been nicked and can't be seamlessly reattached. Sheriff Whitaker started a small program with the library and the high school about noticing patterns and reporting small things. Mara refused to let the cafe lock its doors early anymore. She said the town needed places where light stayed on. For me, the terror didn't vanish in the courtroom. There are nights when the dunes call up the old hummed lullaby, and my skin remembers the way his eyes learned my face. There are moments when I still reach for the leather box out of habit and find it empty. The scars are mostly interior, a sharper watchfulness, a deeper gratitude, and a strange sweetness when the pier lights come on. Gavin and I sometimes meet at Mara's table and sit in that easy silence people make when they are grateful to be alive together. If there's a moral to this, it is not neat. It's not that you can always fix the world by finding the right person to blame or the right proof. Sometimes what helps is stubbornness, the kind that makes someone drive down a road at dawn, the kind that keeps a sister from leaving a sheriff's office until she has a name to hold, the kind that makes a baker leave you a pie. Community stitches up what a single person cannot. The ring is back where it belongs now, on a finger that recognized it and slid it on like a small ritual. The stones with names remain, cataloged in a file that Tom keeps in his desk, a reminder and a warning. Marcus is behind bars and will be for a long while. The court saw to that, but the town remembers differently now. We remember to check the small things, wife, to call when a light is off that used to be on, to follow up when something doesn't fit. I told you earlier that I liked schedules and sensible things. What I learned is this: some parts of the world are not sensible at all. There are undercurrents and collectors and people who think they are preserving beauty when they are taking life. The line between curiosity and catastrophe is thin. If you walk the pier in October, you'll see people with their hands in their pockets and their jackets tight. You might hear a lullaby hummed under the wind that could just as easily be a radio. Remember to take a friend with you. Remember to look for the small things odd and out of place. And when you find something that isn't yours, be careful, but don't let fear be the thing that steals your life. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Aaron Locke. I was 34 when it happened, October 13th, 2019, and for a long time afterward, I couldn't tell whether the place had been waiting for me or I had been walking straight into its waiting. I tell you this now as a man who has been left with a map of scars on his mind and a story that does not soften with time. If you're from Michigan, you know Muskegon. Water-scented air, the hum of cargo trucks along Broadway, winter winds off the lake that can pry a smile into a grimace. You think you know its streets, its old brick storefronts, the neat houses with porches. You think you know how the town looks when the sun is low and the gulls circle over the harbor like punctuation marks. You were wrong, or at least I was. I want to introduce the people who orbit this memory because it matters to me that you see them whole. There was Caleb Voss, my closest friend since we shared a chemistry class in high school. He ran the small bait shop down by the river and had a laugh that sounded like a fishing line snapping tight. There was Lila Monroe, who worked at the library with a way of shelving books so the spines faced just so. She loved order the way some people love religion. There was Deputy Mark Gentry, a broad-shouldered man with a slow, careful voice. If you ever needed someone to stay calm in a storm, you wanted Mark in the room. And then there was me, ordinary job at a manufacturing firm, ordinary apartment above a bakery, the kind of life people describe on cards. Steady, dependable, with bills paid on time, and a dog named Rufus who was mostly ears and stubbornness. The place where it started seems innocent when you say it fast. The old Whitmore property on Lakeshore Road, the kind of house that had been painted hopeful colors once and then left to the weather. People in town whispered about it with the polite distance you use to discuss a failing marriage. The Whitmores vanished 10 years before I ever walked past, leaving curtains like pale flags and a garden that stopped trying. We all had our reasons for not going in. Curiosity is a quiet animal until it's starved. For me, it began with a project. I had taken to photographing Muskegon in its dying light, trying to find beauty in cracked sidewalks and rusted signs. The Whitmore place was a perfect frame. It is necessary, I think, to tell you why I chose to go there that night. There was a storm warning on the radio, a forecast of wind and rain that would make the lake heave. Work had been dull, and a sense of restlessness had been taking up rent in my chest. Caleb joked that I should go photograph a ghost if I wanted something interesting. Lila, when I told her, gave me a worried look and said, "Aaron, don't romanticize decay." Mark, who I saw occasionally in the hardware store, shrugged and said, "People go into empty houses all the time. Just stay on the porch." None of them knew the precise way my curiosity works. Not a single step toward danger, but 1,000 small nudges that, taken together, form a shove. I prepared like anyone preparing for a small excursion. Camera bag, rain jacket, headlamp, a thermos of coffee. The walk from my apartment took 20 minutes at a brisk pace. Muskogee? No, Muskegon. The map in my head was crisp. The bend in Sherman Street, the little diner that stayed open late, the chain-link fence that marks the municipal yard. The Whitmore house sat back from the road, older trees guarding it like sentries. A sagging gate announced that time had been unkind. Up close, the porch was a museum of small ruins, a swing that hung from one chain, a welcome mat eaten circularly by weather, a mailbox that had rusted into silence. My camera found it all obediently, clicking like a metronome. Before the lake wind had a chance to pick up, I was standing on that porch, breathing in the smell of wet wood and something else. Iron, or old cloth, or the memory of someone who once poured a cup of tea at a wooden table in the same light. I should have left then. I didn't. Instead, I found a side door that was unlatched. It took a little nudge to open. The foyer inside was a tomb of winter coats and newspaper clippings. A layer of dust lay over everything like a soft white blanket. Someone had left a child's shoe on the stair, 2 sizes too small. There were photographs on the wall, faces that smiled from the year the house believed in itself. I told myself I was only documenting. Character matters here because fear grows like ivy around who you were before the night. I was the kind of man who cataloged and labeled his fear. This is how it felt in my chest. This is the sound it made. This is where it lodged, behind my throat like a small stone. Caleb, with his practical talk of rope and lanterns, kept me earthly. Lila, with books of architecture and community histories, offered context. Deputy Gentry's calm voice promised procedure and paperwork if anything went wrong. I needed those anchors. By the time the storm moved in across the lake, the town lights were distant, the sky turned iron, and I felt oddly secure because I had a plan. Take pictures, leave. People often ask whether there was a warning, a sign, a voice, a figure on the stairs. Memory, like a house, remodels itself to suit the occupant. What I can tell you without embellishment is this: there were noises that didn't fit the house. Not a creak from the settling wood, but a deliberate thump, like a footfall upstairs when the rest of the house promised silence. There were drafts that did not match the cracked windows. My headlamp picked up shapes that photography could not explain. Shadows that kept their edges when everything else blurred in the rain. For 700 words, I have brought you here to meet my town, the people who orbit my life, the old house with its polite decay, and the small decisions that become crucial. I have told you why I went, where I went, who I loved and who loved me in return, and the tiny details that made the house feel less like an object and more like a presence. I have prepared you for the moment when choice dissolves into inevitability. And now the main story begins. The night closes like a fist, and what follows is not the product of a single fearful heartbeat, but of many quiet currents converging. I close my eyes and try to remember how the first clear thing happened. The sound on the stair, the way the light went wrong, and the exact second I understood that the house was looking back. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The thump on the upstairs landing was a punctuation mark that split the night into before and after. I remember the exact rhythm, 1, pause, 2, like someone testing each stair as if counting breath. My headlamp made the foyer theatrical, focused circles of light that left the rest of the house in ink. The smell of damp wood was suddenly laced with something metallic, not quite blood, something older like coins left in a drawer for too long. My hands shook, which is to say my hands did what hands do when the part of you that knows better has gone out for a smoke and left fear babysitting. I climbed because I do that sometimes. I march toward the question instead of away from it. The staircase was narrower than I remembered from the photographs of the town registry. Wallpaper peeled like old scabs, and the runner was a strip of tired red. At the top of the stairs, the air changed temperature the way water changes when you cross a current. It went sharp and thin. There was no one there, only a corridor with doors that refused to look open. Yet, when I swung my light over the hallway, the beam landed on something that made me drop a small curse. Scribbled across the peeling plaster, scrawl and hurried, were letters that looked like someone had used the heel of a shoe to write in the dust. Leave. Leave. I told myself it was vandalism, kids with a taste for theatrics, but I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stiffen like a warning flag. I took a picture anyway. If you ask me why, I'll tell you the truth. Habit, curiosity, evidence. Photographs are my way of saying, I saw this. They keep me honest. I held the phone out, and the screen reflected a face I did not like seeing. My own. Tight and moonlit, with the hallway behind me like a throat. The second-floor rooms were small and smelled of lavender and old linens. One door opened with the kind of sound an old hinge makes when it is relieved of a secret. I trained the headlamp, and the beam landed on a child's room. Tiny furniture, a rocking horse with one eye chipped, a dresser with stubby pulls, walls that had once been painted with clouds. A mobile hung over the crib, still turning, but there was no breeze to account for the motion. On the floor, nearest the crib, was a single red mitten. Not a shoe like earlier. That's how my mind kept trying to make sense. Objects that belonged to children everywhere, as if the house insisted on a small absence. I felt something brush past my shoulder, soft as a memory. I spun, and the beam cut a slice of the corridor, empty save for dust motes that floated like tiny, slow galaxies. When I laughed, it came out like dry leaves. Okay, I told the house, and the house answered by closing the door behind me with a firm, final click. I swear to you I did not push it. I heard the latch as if from the other side of a wall. The temperature dropped. My breath steamed like a small lantern. My phone showed me 1 bar of service. I called Caleb because instinct meant calling someone who understood holes in old boats and how to fix a stubborn motor. The call went straight to voicemail as if the town had flipped a switch. I left a short message for Lila too, an explanation softened by a bit of humor. If I don't come back, photograph something for me, I half joked, and hearing my own voice try to be light felt like an insult to whatever watched me. That's when the lights went. Not a flicker, but the kind of surrender that makes every small noise you had been masking with sight bloom into a chorus. My headlamp's beam shrank and then threw a single desperate circle. The battery gave the kind of cough phones make before they sleep forever. I fumbled for the spare in my bag and found it coated in dust, like a coin in a jar. My fingers banged against a small box on the dresser and it toppled, revealing a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The top one was addressed in a handwriting that made me feel like someone had knuckled my spine. To anyone who finds us. I remember reading that line twice, because my brain treats the improbable as a puzzle to be solved. The letter was torn in places, ink blurred by time, and the words inside made my stomach go slack. Complaints of noise upstairs, a neighbor who left bread on the porch every weekend, a doctor who came in for a fever and never left. The date at the top was older than I'd expected, 10 years, maybe more. The same era the town mourned the Whitmores. At the bottom, a slanted line of handwriting finished with, "Do not stay after the storm." I should have left then. No story in textbooks ever rewards the person who defies the last line of a longer warning. But the house had its claws in my curiosity. Questions without punctuation, half-whispered stories that can haunt a reasonable mind into foolishness. As I folded the letter back, the rocking horse creaked as if someone had sat on it for an instant. My skin went hot and cold at once. Footsteps returned. Not on the stairs this time, but beneath my feet. The house shifted like a living thing settling its weight. The ceiling above me gave a long, low groan. I followed the sound down through my bones to the front room, where light from the street pooled like a false promise. The front door was locked from the outside. Impossible. Rust eats hinges, but it doesn't invent locks that weren't there. I pressed my hand to the wood. Damp. Someone had been leaning against it. From somewhere behind me, the kitchen perhaps, or the pantry, a child's whisper came. "Are you Aaron?" The name knocked like a fist. My voice, when I found it, sounded small. "Who's there?" I asked, and the house answered by making no sound at all for a long, considerate time, like it was savoring the way I waited. Then the whisper again, closer, thinner. "We can't leave." I grabbed the letters, my spare battery, my camera, and moved toward the door. The lock didn't yield. My shoulder struck wood, the kind of force that makes you taste copper. I stepped back and for the first time felt real physical fear. Not the delicious kind that thrills you on a roller coaster, but primal, the one that makes your feet cold and your hands remember things like how to open a window when your lungs scream. I banged on the windows and they replied with the sound of the storm finding the house's skin. Wind at the eaves, rain searching for seams. Through the glass, the street was a smear of halos and sodium light. No one came. It occurred to me then that the Whitmore house might not be empty enough for neighbors to ignore a man trapped inside. If you live next to a rumor, you learn its cadence and know when to look away. From the hallway, footsteps circled again, precise as a metronome, then stopped at the top of the stairs. The whisper seeped under the door like cold. "Don't go," it said in a child's voice, and then, oddly, in a man's voice, layered over the top, as if the house had multiple tongues. I felt the house listen to me breathe and then decide to speak. I will not pretend I faced whatever came with grand courage. I crouched behind the piano in the parlor because pianos are the most comfortable hiding places in old houses. They are, after all, furniture with secrets. I clutched the letters to my chest like a talisman. The doorbell rang then, a single tone, though no living person could be heard outside. The sound traveled through the wood into my teeth. After that, silence pulled tight as a drum. I waited until my knees stopped shaking. And then, just when the house had me convinced it would allow dawned on before it acted, something knocked from within the walls. A soft, deliberate tapping that spelled 3 beats, a language I couldn't translate but which I understood as attention. The sound moved along the baseboards, under the floor, like small things seeking purchase. I thought of Lila's voice telling me not to romanticize decay. I thought of Caleb's laugh that could lift a mood like wind on a sail. I thought of Reuben. No, not Reuben. Mark, with his slow, careful voice who would know what to do. I lit the spare battery, focusing it into the same small, stubborn circle. The light trembled in the dark as I readied myself to stand. There are moments when action is not optional. The house inhaled, and I exhaled in answer. I eased out from behind the piano. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I eased out from behind the piano like a man who knows he's giving himself away and does it anyway. The house had settled around me, listening with the patience of someone who expects confession. My light cut a raw path across the parlor. A portrait of a stern woman frowned down from above the mantel. A clock stopped at 9:17, and a mirror that flashed a face too slow to be mine. I moved through the rooms with the furtive grace of a trespasser who has become an unwilling tenant. The floorboards under my boots complained in Morse code. Each room told its own small story. The dining room with plates still set in a permanent dinner, cutlery ghosted with tarnish, the study where a ledger lay open, ink-browned into feathered ribs, the sunroom where dust had gathered on a child's kite like a fossil. I kept thinking I heard a shuffle behind a door, and every time I expected hands to push through the wood, nothing came but a hush that felt like being watched through a keyhole. Then I found the attic door. Attics are for secrets and things you mean to forget but never quite do. The pull-down ladder was weighted and complained when I hooked it free. My headlamp found trunks stacked like small islands, crates stamped with destinations that no longer existed. A moth-eaten wedding dress folded across a trunk as if someone had set it down and time forgot to pick it up again. I knelt and pried open a cedar box and found, wrapped in oilcloth, a small leather-bound journal. The spine was cracked like an old man's knuckle. On the inside cover, someone had scrawled in hurried script Whitmore. Not for storms. My thumb brushed the paper and I felt something like a memory tug. I opened it and read. The handwriting changed with the page. Neat one day, frantic the next. There were notes about the lake, that it carried things on its back, that sometimes the wind brought voices that asked for directions. There were sketches of symbols I could not place, circles with lines like teeth. But the pages I couldn't read fast enough were the last ones, written on the night the Whitmores left. They read like a conversation between a man and his fear. We tried to keep it from coming in. It listens, and it learns. If you read this, stay off the porch when the weather turns sideways. The final line had been penned with a hand that shook so violently the ink stamped through. If you bring light, it will show you the mirror it keeps for itself. When I heard the words out loud in my head, the house answered in the only honest way it could. All the radios in the rooms clicked on at once, a dozen static ghosts forming a low, mournful hum. The headlamp in my hand guttered. I snapped the book shut with a rude sound and stuffed it into my jacket like contraband. At some point, I realized I had been downstairs too long. The front windows were a smear of rain and white slashes as the storm hit with a vengeance. The house, which had been merely strange, began to feel like a thing with a pattern. Doorways that should have been parallel seemed to lead to halls that doubled back. The house rearranged itself the way a mind rearranges the furniture of a nightmare. I tried the front door again. It still would not yield. In the glass, I caught reflections, not of me, but of other silhouettes. A shadow of a small boy perched on the porch swing, a woman stooping as if to tie shoes, a man looking out toward the lake. None of them moved. They were like memories pressed against the glass. When I hammered on the frame long and hard enough to taste copper, the shadow of the boy turned and looked straight at me. His eyes were darker than the storm. "Who did you leave?" I whispered, because sometimes when you speak, the house will answer with truth stitched from fragments. The answer was a soft chorus of small voices, not menacing, not cruel, merely tired. "We tried," they said. "We did what we could." There was a pull then, like the invisible draft of a closing door. The kitchen light snapped on, and in the yellow glow something moved that was not wind. A man, not fully present, as if someone had painted his outline and left the filling to the air, followed me into the doorway. He wore an old suit. A father, perhaps, his jaw lined like the leaves outside. His mouth opened in a way that promised words, but the sound that came out was the scrape of furniture across floorboards. A child's laugh leaked from somewhere above like a water pipe. "Why won't they leave?" I asked the apparition, because after a while asking seemed kinder than silence. The man's face softened in a way that made my ribs ache. He reached for something on the counter, a paper bag of groceries that rustled though there were no hands there, and when he turned the light, picked out the name on a label. Whitmore. "Not all of us left," he said. The voice was like a radio tuned slightly off station, a man's voice layered with others. "We tried to take what we could. The lake keeps what it likes, the house keeps the rest." I understood, in a gut-sinking way, that the Whitmores had not simply gone away. They had been taken in fragments and echoes. The house was a repository, a place where absence hardened into shape. It hoarded people the way oceans hoard shipwrecks. I reached for my phone to record him, because evidence is a tether when belief wants to untie you. But the screen showed nothing. A gray blank that reflected the storm as if it were a photograph with no exposure. The man's eyes found mine, and for a second they were achingly clear. "Do not bring light," he said. "It remembers through light. It keeps the parts of us that look back." A soft scratching came from the walls, and then, impossibly, from beneath my boots. The house wanted to be heard. I placed my hand on the floor and felt an odd vibration, like the distant thrum of a train, or the patient heartbeat of something enormous under the water. The journal burned in my jacket under my ribs like proof of something terrible. I tried to make myself leave by walking the rooms in order, parlor, dining room, hallway, front door, as if the house could be tricked by choreography. At the doorway to the hallway, the air wavered, and a smell rose up that was not rot, but remembrant. Old lemon, wood polish, the faint undertone of a hospital antiseptic. I could not tell if that was the memory of housekeeping or something meant to hide another smell. It was there that I saw them, small prints in the dust, not human, but aligned as if scaled to children. They led down the hallway and disappeared at the threshold to the cellar. The cellar, in houses like this, is where the real forgetting often happens. People toss things down there to be less burdened by loss. I told myself not to go down. I told myself every sensible thing people tell themselves when they're about to do the wrong thing. My legs obeyed their own agenda. The cellar steps smelled like old coal. I felt the temperature drop as I descended, as if the house stored its cold in a vault and opened it when invited. At the bottom of the steps, the air became a slow-moving river of sound, a hum that resolved into single words: names, nicknames, numbers, a ledger of the lost. In the beam of my light, I saw things pressed into the walls, toys embedded in plaster, a wedding ring fused to mortar, a child's hair ribbon petrified like coral, and in the far corner, propped against a crate, a dog collar with a tag that read, in etched letters, Rufus. My throat closed. I had sworn two things in my life: to love my dog and to come home to him. Seeing that collar so far from the apartment where Rufus slept on my rug felt like a betrayal, as if the house had reached into my life and plucked something dear just to show it to me. The collar hummed with memory, like a wound that remembers pain. I heard the scratch of small claws on wood behind me, and before I could think, I turned. A figure stepped into the light. Not a boy this time, but a woman whose face was as familiar as heartbreak. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, and the voice was Lila's, then not Lila, as if the house used faces it remembered to be more persuasive. "How do I leave?" I asked. The question sounded stupid in my mouth. She smiled a sad smile and reached out with a hand that cooled me through my jacket. Her fingers brushed mine, and I felt a memory not mine, a child's hand at dusk, a goodbye that never was spoken. "You don't," she said gently, not without something to trade. The cellar laugh that followed was not quite humor. It was the house making a point. I had come in for photographs and curiosity. The house kept accounts. To go, you had to offer an exchange. I thought then of the letters I had found, of the warnings scrawled in dust. Leave. But warnings can be precise in ways that do not help. Leave what? And to where? Upstairs, above my head, the storm beat on as if trying to wash the house clean. Down here, in the carved-out belly of memory, I understood the pattern. People who tried to force the house with light had been claimed with pieces left like breadcrumbs. The Whitmores had not fled. They had tried to bargain, to outmaneuver whatever the lake set against them, and lost in increments. I cradled the journal like contraband and climbed. The house, as if to prove its point, shifted the stairs. I found myself at the top with the parlor behind me and the window that looked out at my own small, mundane town. Through the glass, streetlight burned and nobody was coming. I was more alone than I'd been in years, and not just alone, as one might be in an empty room, but alone in the way you are when everyone you know is on the other side of a river and the bridge has collapsed. I understood at that breathless instant that the only way out might mean leaving something behind I wasn't ready to lose. The house waited. I waited back. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I remember the moment I made the trade as if the world narrowed to a coin spinning in the air. The house did not bargain in words so much as in inevitabilities. It had shown me its ledger: toys in plaster, collars fused to crate wood, letters folded like accusations. And then it tilted its head as if to ask, very simply, what I would give for the door to open. I had my hands full of things that mattered: the leather journal from the attic, the letters tied in ribbon, my camera with its hard little eye that never lied. The collar with Rufus's name burned like a brand in my memory. I thought of Rufus curled on the rug, of him snoring at my feet, of the low thump of his tail against the baseboard when I came home. I thought of Lila's sensible face, of Caleb's laugh, of Mark's steady voice promising to come check on me if I called. I thought, too, of the Whitmore's last line scrawled in a shaking hand: "If you bring light, it will show you the mirror it keeps for itself." "Take this," I told the air, though I didn't know if the house heard pleas or only transactions. I set the journal on a trunk in the attic and let the ribboned letters fall like a small offering at the foot of the staircase. I unfastened Rufus's collar from around my neck. I'd taken it with me the way people take a talisman, and placed it on top, the metal tag glinting weakly in my headlamp. The house paused, a sound like a many-roomed breath. Then the hearth cracked open, and a warmth like old tea reached out and touched my fingers. It was not kindness. It was a thing acknowledging a bargain made in the only currency it understood: memory and belonging. Leave one thing of equal weight, the voice in my head said, and it was all the voices that lived in the walls, the Whitmores, whispers of neighbors, a child's laugh folded into a man's apology. I realized then the exchange would not be simple. The house did not want objects alone, it wanted meaning, anchors, the things that make a person more than a collection of bones and routines. I thought stupidly to hand over a photograph, a small piece of Rufus's life, but photographs fade. The house wanted what made us ours. It wanted something living or the memory of the living, something that would keep its tables set and its mirrors honest. The sellers had told me what the price looked like. Pieces of folk threaded into plaster. The thought of giving up a piece of myself made me dizzy. Give a memory of my father leaving when I was 7? Give the morning I first learned to read, or the day Rufus came home from the shelter and followed me like gravity? The house's appetite was not neat. I closed my eyes and saw all the things the Whitmores had lost. A child who wouldn't leave a porch, a man who listened to the wrong call across the lake. I saw calendars with dates circled and never reopened. I thought of Lila's warning, don't romanticize decay, and how it didn't help now. Bargaining is not romance. It's arithmetic done badly when the numbers are tied to the heart. I chose then, with a clarity that surprised me, to leave a part of my future. I thought of all the mornings I had hoped to make with Rufus, the small, ordinary things. Walking the lake path when spring blew new wind across the water, the day Rufus would stop limping from old age, the lazy evenings. I offered those unwritten mornings. I offered expectation itself, the idea of continuity, the soft, certain belief that I would come home to the same life. I said the words aloud because I wanted witnesses. I give you my tomorrow with him. The house accepted as if I had handed it something it had been missing. The attic shook like a sigh. Somewhere below, something settled into place with a dull, terrible satisfaction. The front door unlatched. When I pushed it, I expected light or thunder or a hand to yank me back. What I got was the night, rain-driven and glorious in its indifference. The street was as it had always been, and as if nothing had happened. My pockets were lighter, though I couldn't say which pocket had lost what. I smelled the salt from the lake and felt the wind fight the hem of my jacket. I ran. I ran until the Whitmore house was a silhouette behind me, and the town lights were a smattering of safety. I half expected the house to follow on the soles of my shoes, to tug me back with the weight of everything I'd left in it, but once you break the circle, it does not always pursue in the way stories promise. Sometimes it keeps its score and waits. I found Mark at the diner with coffee gone cold on the counter and Caleb a little wild-eyed from worry. Lila had brought Rufus's favorite blanket because she'd thought, like any practical librarian, that comfort helped. The moment I saw Rufus's blanket, a sound came out of me like a choke. I told what I could. They listen like people who hold the maps of other lives and know which parts to smooth. Mark questioned the house legally the way men who have to document things do. Logs, reports, the mechanical kindness of record-keeping. He sent deputies to pry at the windows and take photographs. They found nothing in the cellar but damp and old Sunday dress. They called it a hoax, a tragedy of mileage and weather, and a man on the edge of too much curiosity. I let them write whatever they needed to write. I could not look at the Whitmore house in the same straightforward way again. The town prefers simple stories. In the weeks that followed, I learned what my bargain had cost. I could no longer remember the exact sound Rufus made when he breathed in his sleep. I could still picture him lying by the heater, but the tiny idiosyncratic noises, the way his whiskers twitched at dawn, those details had been smoothed away like stones in a stream. Friends thought I was being forgetful. I called it tribute. The collar was never found. I would wake sometimes with a blank room in my head where a parade of small mornings used to march. Memory, I discovered, can be traded like coin. People asked me if what had happened was true. I told them that truth bends. It is sometimes a utility, sometimes a weight you read aloud only to make it less lonely. Mark believed enough to keep a quiet file. Caleb believed, with a practical edge. He fixed the hinge on the back door of his bait shop and checked it twice at night. Lila wrote me notes with a neatness that like prayer. I learned to live with the hollow the house had taken. I had to fill it with work and sleep and the kind of small human rituals that stitch a life back together. I don't go down to the lake at night anymore. I don't go past Whitmore Road when the weather warns of sideways rain. When I drive by, the porch swing still hangs and the curtains still wave in the windows like sails. Sometimes, rarely, I think I see a child's shadow on the porch, and my chest seizes up in a way that makes me think the house is keeping an eye on me as much as I keep one on it. There are things I regret. I regret the bargain that made my escape possible. I regret the collar I left and the mornings I gave away. But I survive, and survival is not always clean. It keeps you honest in ways that are small and persistent. Memory is a strange market. You pay and you learn to live with the receipt. If you ever walk past the Whitmore place when the wind is low and the gulls have not yet begun their circling, be kind to the porches and do not knock on doors that are meant to be shut. And if you carry a talisman, a collar, a photograph, a promise, hold it a little closer when the rain begins to sound like knocking. This is my story. I tell it so the ledger is not only the houses anymore. Tell your friends. Keep your collars. Teach Rufus's days to your own small memory so that something of him lives more than a label in a cellar. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Jacob Whitlock. I was 28 years old the night it happened, August 12th, 2019. And I've told the tale a dozen different ways since, but I swear to you now the version I'll give is the truest one I can stand to remember. Before I dive into the dark part, the part that still keeps my hands cold when the wind off Lake Michigan bites, I need to tell you about the people, the place, and the slow little decisions that led me into that particular kind of wrongness. Stories are crooked things. They bend toward the moment they want to reveal. So let me straighten out the crookedness first. Muskegon was the kind of place people left and sometimes came back to, like an old sweater that fits funny but still smells like your mother's kitchen. I grew up 3 blocks from the old rail yard and learned to fish off a rickety pier with a man named Frank DeWitt. Frank was a retired shipwright who said more by the set of his jaw than by his words. My sister, Tessa, ran a bakery downtown. Her cinnamon rolls could quiet down a room. My best friend, Mason Talley, drove a tow truck and told stories with a grin wide enough to convince you he'd found a ghost in the middle of Main Street and done everyone a favor by hauling it away. The place we planned to spend that weekend in August had a name you could find on no map, a narrow spit of land between Muskegon Lake and a forgotten tributary we called Blackwater Creek. Locals joked the name came from the way the water swallowed light when fog came in. There was a small, abandoned cabin there, the sort of structure that leans like listening to the wind, with a cracked foundation and a porch that threatened to give way if you leaned on the wrong metaphor. We'd been to the cabin before once, years earlier, when we were barely old enough to be reckless without consequence. That time we left without incident. That time the night belonged to cigarette smoke and cheap beer and laughter that sounded like we believed in forever. By 2019, I'd been living 3 hours south, working as an electrician on industrial projects. I came back to Muskegon for the weekend because my father's voice on the phone had been thinner than usual, because I wanted one last river sunset with people who knew where I'd learned to walk. Mason called it a reboot. Tessa insisted on packing sandwiches like she was preparing us to be rescued. Sophie Klein, who I'd been seeing in fits and starts that summer, said she wanted to come and see the place I'd told her about. Sophie had a small scar on her knuckle from a childhood bike crash that made her smile sheepishly when she talked, and she never stayed quiet when the moon made the water silver. We pulled into the gravel with the heat of day softening into late afternoon. The cabin looked the same. Paint long gone, a sag in the porch, a rusted tin mailbox that still had a name, not ours, burned faintly on it. There were signs of other visitors, cigarette butts crushed into the soil, a ring of stones blackened with previous fires. That was ordinary and expected. What I began to notice in the hours before darkness was a different ordinary, the way the marsh fog moved like a slow animal, pausing at the tree line to listen, the way pigeon feathers collected it in a wheelbarrow and turned iridescent in the perpendicular dusk light, the way the old lighthouse out on North Point, a landmark with a lantern room we'd climbed as kids, seemed to blink slower than I remembered, like an old man forgetting his own schedule. I'll tell you about the town's stories because they matter. Muskegon had an oral museum of small terrors. The dredge that ate a boy in 1947, they still call the place Boys Bend. The freighter that ran aground some foggy November and left a rusted hull that joked and groaned with every high tide. The watchman who'd once been fired for warning of storms that never came and moved down the shore muttering about lights that belonged to no man. None of those tales felt like prophecy to me, just the kind of background noise you get used to living near a lake that remembers sailors by name. Character matters here. Mason was practical and warm, always the first to offer a hand when wood needed hauling. Sophie was skeptical and gentle. She could see through a boast and still laugh at it. Tessa arrived with a thermos and a box of her daughter's drawings, the sort of small domesticity that felt like an anchor. And then there was me, who liked to think I observed more than I interfered, who could fix a fuse but not always a friendship. We were an uncomplicated crew until the light fell. We built a fire, ate under a sky that marched from bruised to black, and told the old stories with the braggadocio that men who feel immortal use as talismans. Somewhere near midnight, the breeze off the lake picked up, and the fog came in thicker than I'd seen in years, swallowing the tree line so that our small circle of light on the porch felt like a harbor in a larger, breathing darkness. That fog was the first thing that didn't obey the ordinary rules. It hugged the ground, it smelled of salt and something else, metallic and old, like coins buried in a shoebox. Mason whistled, and Sophie turned the volume down on the old radio. Tessa suggested we head to bed. She always did when the wind started to carry the marsh's voice. I promised I would do the dishes. Mason said he'd take one last walk to the point to see if the lighthouse light was on. He laughed, little man-as-God laugh, and walked off into the fog. If you want the main part of this story, the thing that changed how I sleep, know this: it doesn't rush. It waits. It finds the slowest pace it can wear you down with. And if you're patient like I was that night, you'll learn how it approaches, like a tide deciding to cross a sandbar. That's where the real story begins. It started with a sound, small and inland from the lake, like an old shoe scuffing in gravel. It was close enough that I thought it might be Mason coming back, and I stepped off the porch with a mug in hand, the steam ghosting into the fog. The light from my phone made a thin spear through the mist, and for a moment I could see the sail of the lake, calm and obedient. Then I saw it, two prints in the mud, side by side, but one set deeper than the other, as if two people had walked close together, except the second print followed no natural stride. It was half an inch, maybe an inch too long, and the toes, if you could call them that, pointed inward like someone trying to hide their hunger. I called Mason's name. The fog took the sound and chewed it slow. The porch behind me creaked, as if the cabin were settling in for the worst of the night. I took 3 steps toward the point, and then another sound hit, a whisper of cloth, not made by the wind. I remember thinking absurdly that this was one of those nights when everything was a trick: fatigue, city light in our eyes, memory playing puppets. Then the whisper said my name. Jacob, it breathed, soft as cigarette smoke. I froze, because names, your own name, when spoken from a place that isn't human, are the only things that can make you feel truly naked. I called back. Silence answered. Then, from the wet black where the sky met the water, something moved. It didn't run. It didn't walk. It unfolded like a shadow deciding to become a body. I can tell you where my hands went, what I dropped, how the taste of fear is metallic on the tongue. I can tell you the phone slipped from my fingers and hit the mud, and the screen blossomed into errant light. I can tell you I ran partly to the sound and partly away from it, because humans do not always make the rational choice under pressure. I can tell you that when I reached the point, Mason was not there. There was only a smear on the pier, as if someone had been dragged, slow and patient, into the reed-choked mouth of the creek. And that is how it began, the thing that stretched the night, and my certainty thin. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The fog wrapped itself around the point like a hand that refused to let go. Mason's absence hollowed the night like a missing tooth. Obvious the moment you ran your tongue over it. Sophie swore she heard him laugh after he left, like he was teasing the darkness. Tessa clutched her thermos and looked like she had already decided the world had tilted a little too far. I felt the tilt in my knees. We split up the way people do when fear is new and hope still thinks two flashlights will outmatch whatever it is. Sophie and I went down the boardwalk toward the reed-choked mouth of Blackwater Creek, while Tessa circled the cabin with a flashlight sweeping the tree line. The beam trembled in her hands. I could see the way she counted each step under her breath. The night pooled around us. The smell of the lake was thicker, like it wanted to be noticed, like it had secrets in its breath. On the pier, I found things that were small and terrible in the way missing things are. Mason's boot lay half buried in the mud. The laces knotted as if someone had pulled them tight with thought. There was a smear on the wood. Not blood, not quite, but a dark iron stain that gleamed with a wet intent. His flashlight was a few yards in the reeds, its batteries still warm from use. And in the muck, pressed into the soft loam, were prints. Human enough at first glance, but wrong when you looked at them, like a pair of gloves had been cut and re-sewn in a hurry. The toes of the prints pointed slightly inward, and the heels had been dragged as if whatever had made them had been pulled sideways. Sophie found his phone in the tall grass. Screen cracked, but still showing life. There were 3 missed calls from Tessa and 1 voicemail. I thumbed it open because the thing we do when the world tilts is hunt for proof it will right itself. The last file in the gallery was a short video Mason had shot with his hand unsteady, 42 seconds of fog swallowing a light, a shape condensing at the edge of the frame, and then the camera jerked. There was a sound on it, like fabric rubbing wet. At the very end, when the image stuttered and blurred, I heard Mason say, clear as a bell through the static, "It's here." We called Sheriff Briggs. He was the kind of man carved from small-town patience, with an easy voice that tried to turn catastrophe into a paperwork problem. He told us they'd organize a search party at first light. He promised he'd come down to the cabin himself, but his truck didn't arrive until an hour later, because appointments and other calls exist even when reality is fraying at the edges. When he did show, he stood on the porch and surveyed the lake and made a smaller man than his uniform felt. "You all drink much?" he asked, and the question landed as if to test whether we were telling a truthful story or inventing one. Sophie's voice broke when she said no. Tessa said Mason had been happy and joking. I felt like twisting the phrase, "I saw him go," until the truth bled out of it. Sheriff Briggs took the phone, watched the video, and frowned in a way that meant the world had placed something in front of him it didn't have a ready category for. "We'll canvass the shore," he said. "We'll check the dredge, the hull near North Point. We'll call the county." He said all the right things, but I could see his jaw tighten when he bent down and examined the prints. "These aren't good," he muttered. He wrote something in his notebook, one of those little records that would later be typed into a report that couldn't hold the night. He asked if anyone had seen anything else, and Tessa, steady as a metronome when fear became custom, told him about the whisper. The way the fog had mouthed my name. The sheriff's pen paused, and for a second I thought he might protest that fog doesn't whisper names. Then he nodded like a man who had heard worse things from other people on other nights and needed to keep breathing. The search yielded nothing but small, accusing details. A derelict rowboat was found tethered at Boys Bend with a single oar bent as if struck. Mason's truck was still at the cabin, parked where he'd left it, headlights cold. The towpath had prints that led to the water and stopped as if the ground itself had taken them. At sunrise, the lake was a sheet of gray. The fog thinned, but it left behind a residue in the air, a metallic tang that sat behind your teeth. People did the things they do when the edges of stories start to fray. They organized shifts. They called in divers, though the county dive team later said the visibility in Blackwater was the kind of blind that made searching more dangerous than the risk. They set up lights. Someone from the university came with a thermal camera and muttered about how shallow the creek was, and tried to explain physics and current to a group of men and women who had watched a friend disappear into the reeds. Mason's sister, an earnest woman I'd only met once, arrived with a box of his clothes and photographs, and looked like a person made entirely of questions. None of the searching found the thing we were after. What it found were marks. the language of a presence that preferred symbols to speech. On the underside of the pier, someone had carved a pattern into the wood, 3 concentric circles with cross hatches like scales. It was not the kind of carving a bored teenager would make. The lines were precise, deliberate. Sheriff Briggs frowned and took a rubbing with a pencil and paper, like he'd seen enough oddities to know to record the small things that make bigger things believable. That evening, exhausted and raw, we tried to sleep. Sleep where we could. Tessa curled into the couch and Sophie fell asleep on the porch swing. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling like it was a sky I could read. The lake breathed in and out. Then the radio in the cabin, an old AM that had been tuned to static most of the night, filled the room with a voice that made my blood run colder than the lake. It was our town's old station, usually the voice of traffic and high school sports. For a patchwork of seconds in the middle of the hum, it sounded like someone whispering my name, Jacob. Not enough to be a word, but enough to be a direction. Sophie woke with a start, flashlight in hand, eyes huge. She swore she heard other names threaded through the static, like a chorus of memories hitching a ride on a radio wave. We thought we were awake. Horror has a way of proving you wrong about that. Later, when we listened to the station recording the sheriff's men pulled from the tower, the files showed nothing but hissing. The whisper had been there. Only ears could have caught it in the moment. That night, I stood at the edge of the water until my legs went numb, and I tried to map the way the reeds made shadows. I tried to imagine Mason's last steps. I tried to reason the thing into being an accident. Each attempt felt like a child patching a dam with leaves. The thing about terror is you learn it in small curricular increments. The way your world rearranges around missing people. The way guilt grows like mold in unventilated spaces. People spoke of Mason in the passive tense as if distance could protect them. Friends who had once been careless around the edges of life began to measure their words and their walks. Tessa set out a string of candles on the porch and lit them one by one as if illuminating the cabin might create a map Mason could follow. On the third night, the lighthouse at North Point did something it had never done before. It blinked in a sequence, a slow, deliberate pattern like Morse code. The light blinked 3 times, then paused, then 2 times. I thought, foolishly, it might be a signal from the Coast Guard. Sophie, reading things she was not meant to see into the pattern, began to sing a nursery rhyme quietly under her breath, one her grandmother used to sing, about a child who walks in the fog and never returns. The song was tiny and wrong, and perfectly human. When the light blinked again, I heard a sound from the marsh, low and wet and patient. It was the first time that the night felt like it was communicating with us, rather than acting out of indifference. We had questions with no answers, and answers that weren't answers at all. And there, in the hollow between what was lost and what remained, a new kind of story took hold, one that would outgrow the neat lines of police reports and family dinners, one that would insist on more than logic. I stood there, hands in my pockets, and promised myself the truth would come. Promises are funny things in places like Muskegon. They are easy to make and hard to keep. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The third night took the shape of a promise I didn't want to keep. It was the kind of night where the air felt patient, as if it had been waiting to see how we would move. After 2 days of searching and small discoveries, the town had split like a seam. Some people murmured about currents and bad luck. Others folded their hands and talked about things older than reason. We reached for explanations like lifelines. None of them held. We spent the afternoon trying to make sense. Eloise Marlowe, the town librarian with sharp glasses and a memory for every obituary, came by with a stack of yellowed newspapers and a willingness to look for patterns. She sat on the porch with the papers spread out like a map. "There's always been fog along this stretch," she said, voice thin with the weight of archives. "But here, look." She tapped a faded headline from 1954. "Local boys vanish near Blackwater. Search yields symbols." Another from 1979 reported a fishing skiff found adrift with nets cut clean and no sign of the crew. Patterns are patient things. When you look for them, they find you. Reverend Caldwell stopped by, a man with hands built for prayer and a mouth that rarely left the shape of a consoling phrase. He prayed for Mason in the kitchen like prayer could stitch absence back into a face. There are places, he said softly, where the border between memory and water grows thin. His words didn't comfort. They carved space for the idea that whatever had taken Mason might not be done. That evening, they organized a broader sweep. People came from nearby towns with dogs that hesitated at the edge of the reeds and flashlights that tried to punch holes in fog. We waited for answers and instead got the ordinary. People showing up, coffee being passed, hands held in the dark like talismans. I was restless. Sleep had become a small commodity traded for wakefulness. Around midnight, when the lantern in North Point blinked its slow code again, I walked alone toward the marsh with only a thin coat and a headlamp. I told myself I was looking, that I would find something tangible, a glove, an imprint, a scrap of fabric, anything that could be filed away and explained. What I wanted, secretly, was to make the night cough something up and hush the way it had been breathing down our necks. The boardwalk to the creek smelled of water and rot. The headlamp's beam sliced the fog into a narrow, shaky corridor. Somewhere behind me, the cabin was a faint glow, a promise of warmth and people and the small, civilized noises of a world that keeps working. Out here, the world had paused. I heard the voice before I saw it. Soft, low, the rasp of breath drawing letters out of the mist. Jacob, it said. My name again, the way an old wound remembers its own shape. I stopped. The hair along my forearms prickled with the cold of it. The voice was familiar, but not wholly human. It held the memory of Mason's laugh in it, and the thinness of something that had been in the water too long. Who's there? I said, and my own voice sounded like gravel. The answer was a laugh. Not Mason's exactly, but threaded with it. Then the reeds parted, and someone, or something, stepped into the narrow beam of light. My headlamp caught the outline of a figure, tall and thin, like a coat hung on a wire. For the briefest of seconds, I believed it was Mason. The slant of shoulders, the tilt of the head. Then the face resolved and my breath left me in a single, ragged exhale. It wasn't Mason. It wore his jacket, though how it had gotten the jacket I couldn't say. Its face was wrong in a way that made recognition a cruelty. Features blurred as if painted in water. Where its eyes should have been, there were only darker circles, like holes in a map. It moved with a grace that made no sound, a silent animal gliding among the reeds. My muscles wanted to run. My feet glued to the boardwalk. Show yourself, I said, because men say the stupid things when they think bravado can hold back a tide. It cocked its head and exhaled a sound that was almost a word. Mason, it said, but the syllables slurred like something trying to remember a name it once cherished. When the thing spoke, the world tilted in a way I couldn't write. I remember the next minutes in fragments, my hand reaching without thinking toward the pocket where I kept a pocket knife. The thing stepping closer until I could smell the river on it, a scent like old coins and damp cloth. The way my lamp bounced off something metallic at its throat. A watch, the glint of a chain, and how my heart did a small, traitorous flip at the sight. Where's Mason? I asked. The question was a rock thrown into still water. The ripple did something to the creature. Its mouth opened. There was a wet, rust-like taste to the sound, and then a voice came that was more collage than speech. Mason's laugh, my father's scolding, Sophie saying something I'd once promised to remember. The mash of those voices pressed against my skull like a tide. The creature reached a hand out. It moved with deliberate care, like someone returning a borrowed thing. The fingers, too long, too knuckled, traced my jaw in a gesture that was intimate and wrong. I tasted copper on the air and felt a pressure behind my eyes, the kind you get when you hold your breath too long. Come, it said. Not a command, a suggestion. Something inside me, whether courage or blind need to be near the friend I couldn't find, stepped forward. The boardwalk creaked under my weight like an old man complaining. For a moment, a sliver of a chance that feels like salvation, I thought I might touch the thing and find Mason. That was the cruelest part. Hope is a hand that will lead you into places you should not go. Then the reeds shivered, and a second figure peeled itself from the dark. It was smaller, and where the first had worn Mason's jacket, the second wore something that looked like my own sweatshirt. My body unspooled with a horror I can't compress into words. The second figure had a face like mine in the way that a portrait looks like its sitter if you drown it in water. It smiled without humor and held out a hand that was mine. I stepped back. The first figure's fingers brushed my sleeve, and the touch was like cold water. My knees gave in a way that felt obscene. I laughed once, a short animal sound that tasted of fear. The fog listened and thickened, as if savoring what it had lured me into. Then, without warning, the boardwalk beneath the figures cracked. Wood splintered with a shout. For a heartbeat, the fog showed me the underbelly of things. Roots, slick mud, the dark throat of the water, and I realized I was sliding, not because of the thing's hand, but because the planks had been undermined, rotten from the inside like a secret. I grabbed for the railing, nails cutting into my palm, and the world split into two directions, up toward the cabin and down toward a cold mouth. I managed to haul myself back. My fingers bled, and the taste of iron flooded my mouth. The two figures wavered like images on glass. Then, as if a conductor had withdrawn his baton, they receded, folding back into the fog as if they had been puppets released from strings. I lay on the boardwalk for a long time after, watching the moon ripple off the lake. My hands shook until dawn. I thought I had been spared something worse. I told myself the encounter had been a trick of exhaustion, a hallucination born of fear and too many sleepless hours. But when I went back to the cabin, there on the porch table where I had left my pocket knife, sat Mason's watch, the glass cracked and the hands frozen at 12:13, the exact time Mason had called me before he left. That watch changed the texture of the night. It was proof and accusation, a small, undeniable fact that insisted the encounter had not been just in my head. I looked at my reflection in the window and didn't know which of the two familiar faces would wake tomorrow. The town began to talk in lower voices. Some swore the fog had always been hungry. Others looked to the water and asked whether the lake takes what it wants. Reverend Caldwell organized a prayer lantern and vigil. Eloise dug up more clippings, and the pattern grew longer, the years older. Sheriff Briggs tightened his jaw and told us to lock our doors. And somewhere behind those ordinary precautions, the thing learned the shape of us. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. After that night, the town split into the people who wanted to forget and the people who wanted to fix. Fixing, as I learned, rarely looks like fixing. It looks like bargaining, improvisation, late-night carpentry, and a willingness to go where the living are most afraid to walk. We organized another search, this time by plan. Sheriff Briggs, finally looking like a man who had stopped pretending he could paper over the world, took charge. Reverend Caldwell read psalms by the pier until his voice was small and raw. Eloise Marlowe brought every scrap of local history she could find and spread out the evidence like a map. People came with boats, with ropes, with prayers they'd been saving for an emergency. Mason's sister and a few of his old friends came too. Grief consolidates people in strange ways. It was Eloise who finally pointed out the pattern no one wanted to see. The carvings, the boat adrift, the watch stopped at 12:13, newspaper clippings. There were gaps in the record, years where nothing was reported, and then clusters of disappearances near Blackwater Creek. She believed in patterns the way other people believe in weather. These events, she said, come in a tide. They want something, and if they don't get it, they take. We argued about what something could be. We proposed nets, lights, divers. Reverend Caldwell proposed prayer circles and fasts. Sheriff Briggs proposed a perimeter and watch shifts. What none of us could do, at first, was agree about who would step into the dark. I suppose part of a story like mine is how ordinary bravery looks when lit by fear. It is not always heroics. Sometimes it is stubbornness or guilt or the simple arithmetic of love. I wanted Mason back, not as a ghost or a trick, but as a person who could roll his eyes at my jokes and complain about the weather. That want is a dangerous thing. It can make you a good man or a fool. On the fourth night, with the tide low and the marsh breathing in and out like a beast with patience, we set our plan into motion. We brought Mason's truck down and formed a line of lanterns along the boardwalk. People held hands like a chain of hope. Sheriff Briggs asked for volunteers to walk the pier and call Mason's name into the dark. He looked at me like a man already aware I would say yes. I walked with Mason's watch in my palm. It felt like a question. The glass was spiderwebbed and the minute hands stubbornly stuck at 12:13. Tessa handed me a small, folded thing, a drawing from her daughter, a sun with a crooked smile. Sophie touched my arm and said nothing. The silence between friends is thick sometimes. It is the place where the truth either hides or grows teeth. We walked to the point. The fog had been waiting there, as patient as ever. The lanterns made our shadows long and trembling. Reverend Caldwell led a quiet prayer. His voice was a thread in a dark cloth. Eloise started to hum an old hymn that no one sang anymore. The sheriff radioed to the county. There was static on the line like a breath. I stood at the very edge of the pier and looked down. The water was black, oily with the reflection of the moon. For a breath, I felt like I would fall backward. The idea of turning away had a mercy to it. But the watch in my hand felt heavier than guilt. It felt like an accusation. I spoke Mason's name out loud. The sound seemed to sink and then come back as if the lake itself were remembering. "Please," I said to whatever listened, "give him back." The fog answered by curling tighter against the reeds. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then from the water, something moved. Not a shape so much as a suggestion of a shape. Two pale hands, the exact size of Mason's, breaking the surface. The hands trembled, then rested on the pier. People gasped. Reverend Caldwell said a prayer that ended in a cracked whisper. Mason's arm followed. It was thin and wrapped in a jacket soaked slick with river water. The jacket was torn but familiar. A head surfaced, hair plastered to a face that was both Mason's and not. His eyes opened, and for a second the world held its breath because that look was us. Surprised, tired, too young to be so final. He coughed, and the sound was a wet exhale. He tried to reach for me, and his fingers fumbled. I knelt, hands shaking, and brushed the hair from his forehead. His skin was cold and smelled of river and old pennies. I wanted to lift him up, to drag him back into our circle, but when I touched him, the world narrowed to the bead of glass at the center of the watch in my hand. Something like a thought, older than words, slid along the pier. It tasted of salt and rust. Eloise, who had been studying the old clippings, stepped forward and began to speak lines she had read aloud from a 19th century fisherman's journal. It was a list of names, offerings, a way to anchor time. She tossed a handful of pebbles into the water and named each one. A memory, an apology, a promise. "Return what you take," she said, "or the taking won't stop." Music swelled low in my chest. Reverend Caldwell's voice, Sheriff Briggs' practical calm, the murmur of people holding their breath. The thing in the water, the fog that had worn faces like masks, reacted. It reached toward the pier with a slow, liquid motion, and for an instant Mason's face contorted as if he were trying to remember his own name. Eloise's voice grew louder. She told us where in the papers the last community had offered what the marsh wanted. A watch, a song, a memory. She said something simple and terrible. You cannot trade nothing for everything. It was then I understood. The watch wasn't just proof, it was a key. Mason's watch had been what the fog used to stitch itself to him. Objects tether the creek's hunger, and if you return the tether snaps. I stood with a choice that felt like stepping off a cliff or holding the cliff for others. The watch ticked, stubborn and small in my hand, a dying heartbeat. If I threw it in, would the lake return what it had taken? Or was I bargaining with a thing that ate bargains for breakfast? I closed my fingers around the glass and remembered a dozen small moments. Mason laughing at a stupid joke, Sophie's hand finding mine, Tessa's candles on the porch. I thought of the way the town had gathered, ragged and brave like a net. Then I hurled the watch into the mouth of Blackwater Creek. It hit the water, and the sound was small, like a bell in a deep room. The ripples spread and the fog convulsed, like a held breath being released. Mason's body went still. For a heartbeat, the world paused on an edge. Then the only sound left was the wind and the slow, astonished sobbing of people who had watched something terrible unclench. Mason didn't come back the way he left, with a laugh and a cigarette. He came back out of the marsh like someone waking from a long sleep. He could not remember the middle. He could remember only shore and the smell of pennies and the scratch of a watch somewhere deep and hollow. He was alive in the sense that his chest rose and his eyes focused, but the fog had taken more than hours. It had taken something like a seam in him. He would never again be wholly the same. None of us were. After we carried him up the pier and wrapped him in blankets, Reverend Caldwell said a short prayer of thanks and cautioned us not to become too certain. "The water takes what it wants," he said. "Tonight, it returned a face. Tomorrow, it may ask for a different thing. Eloise found pages in the library that suggested towns had made bargains like ours before. Offerings, remembrances, small funerary gifts tossed into the water to satiate a hunger. They were not guarantees, just lifelines thrown across a tide. Sheriff Briggs wrote notes in his little pad, which would later join the wider list of things people record to keep themselves honest. We buried Mason's watch the next morning under a cedar by the pier, not in an attempt to hide it, but to give it a place where people might remember and leave small things of their own. We started a small ritual, ridiculous and tender. Each year, on August 12th, we leave a candle and a name on the pier. We call it a vigil, and sometimes we joke about it, but mostly we stand and remember that what binds us to each other is the willingness to show up. As for me, I still listen when the wind off Lake Michigan comes in thick and close. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear a whisper that sounds like Mason laughing, and the edge of it is the voice that coaxed me into the reeds. The town changed in small ways. People sleep with their doors locked. Kids avoid the old pier after dark. But the sun still rises in Muskegon, and the bakery still smells like cinnamon. If there's a moral here, it's not neat. The world does not always word courage with tidy endings. Sometimes you give something up and something else fills the space. Sometimes the best you can do is walk back to the cabin with your friends, count the names of the living, and keep a watch on the water. Years from now, when the fog rolls in and the lighthouse blinks slower than it should, someone will tell this story and they'll add their own small details, and the truth will bend like an old road. That's how stories work. They are bargains, too, with memory, with the living, with the dead. My name is Jacob Whitlock. I am older than I was on August 12th, 2019. The scars are small and polite, and my hands still remember the cut of the pier as if it were an old handshake. We didn't beat the marsh so much as we learned to speak to it. We left it a small offering and asked it, with all the imperfect humility we could muster, to let us keep our people. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Mason Hale. I was 29 years old when it happened, October 13th, 2018. I've told this 100 different ways since then, but tonight I'm going to tell it like a man sitting on a folding chair beside a campfire, with the wind from Muskegon Lake nudging the smoke and everyone leaning in to hear the parts that stick in your bones. People ask why I went back to Muskegon at all. It wasn't because I'm brave. Far from it. And it wasn't because I wanted trouble. I grew up in the county, spent summers chasing frogs around the estuary and learning to skip rocks off the pier. By 29, I'd been pulled away by job offers, relationships, the usual centrifugal force of adult life. But that year, my father died. The house on Shoreline Drive sat half empty, and a landlord wanted to sell the place quick. The town was in my blood, so I came back to settle the estate and decide what to do with the old family house. Muskegon is the kind of place that knows its own weather. The town sits on a curve of shoreline that turns the lake into a bowl. Winter storms slam in off Lake Michigan and don't bother asking permission. In October, the air is sharp, the gulls get skinnier, and the lighthouses look like they're holding their breath. For the first part of my stay, I did the practical things. Called the bank, sorted through boxes of my father's coins and postcards, paid a young roofer named Eli Turner to patch the porch roof. People in town remembered my father, and they remembered me as a kid, which felt strange and soft at once. I kept catching myself walking past the old boathouse on Harbor Street like it was a place you could walk through and come out the other side unchanged. Characters matter in a story like this. Let me tell you about the people who drifted in and out of those first weeks. Not all of them stick around in the memory, but some of them do, for reasons I didn't understand until later. There's Eli Turner, the roofer I mentioned. Lanky, easy with a grin, he'd grown up 2 blocks over and could fix anything that leaked. There's Ruthie Lane, who ran the corner cafe where the regulars argued about politics and fish tacos. She had a laugh like a bell and a soft spot for lonely men with paperwork. Then there's Pastor Jim Calder from First Baptist, who offered to help file some of my father's paperwork and kept insisting, "You're not alone, Mason," with the kind of conviction that makes you want to believe him even when you don't. And there was Sam Bishop, my father's old fishing buddy, who smelled of diesel and cigarette smoke and who could tell stories for hours. Sam's stories used to make me roll my eyes, but he always had a way of seeding an idea that would grow slow and strange inside me. I cleared out the house room by room. I found a shoebox of letters under my father's bed. Long, careful, the kind of letters people wrote to each other in the years before texting. Some of them mentioned the boathouse by name. "Meet me by the boathouse after dark," one said in a looping hand that wasn't my father's. Another was ink-stained and only half legible, but it had the name of a woman I'd never heard of, May Whitcomb. I asked Sam about her at the docks, and he rubbed his chin and said, "May? Lord. That name carries." He wouldn't say more. Muskegon has a handful of places that hold memory like moss. The old Perry Marquette shipyard, the grain elevator that looks like an abandoned cathedral, Harbor Street with its boathouses leaning like old men. The boathouse I keep talking about was at the edge of the municipal pier, an aging clapboard structure with windows that had seen 100 winters. People used it as storage. Families kept old life jackets and fishing nets there. From the outside, it seemed harmless enough. From the inside, my father had once said, it had a smell, a mixture of oil, lakeweed, and something older, like cedar, that had soaked up secrets. My father never told me to stay away. He told stories about late-night conversations held there, whispered things under the kerosene lamp. Maybe that's why the letters made me go back. Before the night, things changed. There were ordinary evenings. I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee from Ruthie's, listen to Eli complain about shingles, talk with Pastor Jim about whether grief was a habit. I'd take long walks down to the pier to think, and I'd watch the moon paint a ribbon on the water. Sometimes the town felt like a comforting accident. Sometimes it felt like a place that remembers you even when you don't. There's a weight to small towns, a gently accumulating gravity of stories and reputations. And in Muskegon, those gravities pull harder near the old harbor. I tried not to get drawn into the old gossip, but curiosity is its own kind of hunger. A neighbor mentioned May Whitcomb in passing. "She's one of those names that keep showing up like dandelions," she said, and then offered no more. I asked Ruthie about midnight walks. She told me to be careful because there are folks who don't like strangers on the pier after dark. Sam Bishop, when I pressed him, only said that some doors should stay closed and some things should be left to the lake. That was both the kind of warning you ignore and the kind you never fully forget. The night I'm about to tell you about began like many others, with fog rolling off the lake and the sound of gulls nesting in the rafters. I'd stayed up late sorting more boxes, and by the time I realized it was past 2 a.m, I had a stubborn itch to do something that felt like taking control, to stand somewhere familiar and know what it looked like in the dark. I told Eli I was going down to the boathouse to fetch an old lantern my father used. Eli laughed and told me to be back before the moon decided to go swimming. Nobody thought it would be a big deal. Nobody could have guessed. Now, the part of the night when ordinary steps become the first sounds of a story, this is where the air inside my chest changed. I walked down Harbor Street with a flashlight and my father's key on a string around my neck. The pier creaked under my weight, and the boathouse's paint looked like peeled sunburn. I expect you to imagine the sound of the water licking the pilings, the distant hum of lights on the other side of the bay. I expect you to picture the lamp in my hand, the way my breath fogged out and joined the night. The moment I reached the boathouse door and put my hand on the handle, something moved in the dark that felt like the beginning of an answer I hadn't known I wanted. The lantern was inside, but there was also something else, a footprint in the dust that wasn't mine, fresh and heading away from the door toward the pier. I tell you this now, and I can still feel my heart knocking like a fist on a coffin. I should have turned back then. I should have locked the door and gone home. But I'd come this far to hold a piece of my father's life, and sometimes pain and curiosity are the same appetite. I stepped inside. The air smelled like cedar and wet rope and a faint coppery note I could not place. The lantern sat on a shelf, just as my father had left it. But in the corner, half hidden beneath an old tarp, there was a photograph, a black and white picture of my father and a woman by the pier, the woman's face turned away. The date scrawled on the back matched one of the letters. The story I thought I knew was about to get a lot older. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When I stepped back out of the boathouse with the photograph in my hand, the night felt thinner, like someone had peeled a layer off the dark and left the bones of the air exposed. The photograph's edges were softened by time and salt. My father's jaw was younger, and the woman, May Whitcomb, had a braid the way old pictures make braids look like ropes. On the back, scribbled in a hurried hand, were the words, "Forgive me. Meet me where the pier bows." No date, just that line and a smudge of ink that looked suspiciously like a thumb. I stood there for a long minute, lantern light breathing on the wooden planks, listening. The harbor was mostly asleep except for the whisper of water and the occasional clack of an old piling settling. The footprint I'd seen inside the boathouse had led away from the door and toward the pier. Now, by headlamp, I could see the track in the dust, clear and still damp where moonlight didn't touch. Whoever had been here hadn't gone far. Whoever had come had left with intent. You learn to read small towns like books, the pauses, the unfinished sentences. The footprint told me one of those unfinished parts. It led me along the pier, past fishermen's lines and coils of rope to the old public railing, where decades of hands had left a gray polish. The print stopped there, as if the person had simply stepped off the wood and into the dark. Standing over the water, I felt the lake breathing up at me like an answer trying to remember its question. Then, I heard the humming. It was soft at first, like someone testing the tune. A lullaby. My mother used to hum that same tune when she braided my hair, a crooked little melody that never quite found the right notes. It made my throat tighten. I didn't imagine the connection. There it was, drifting across the water in the exact way my mother's hum would have. The kind of small, human sound that makes a night feel less wide, except it wasn't from the direction the footprint had come. The lantern threw my shadow long and thin across the pilings as I followed the hum toward the old row of boats tied to the pier. One had come loose and drifted a little, its stern scraping softly. On its bench lay a carved wooden toy, a tiny boat with a single blue stripe, the paint flaked by time. I picked it up. Someone had scratched initials into the underside. M.W., May Whitcomb. The initials matched the name on the letters. Heat rose behind my eyes. I felt a tightness I couldn't place, like the tug of a rope being pulled by something under the surface. The hum stopped the second my fingers closed around the toy. The air folded. "Hello?" I said, though I didn't expect an answer. My voice sounded brand new in my ears, like it belonged to someone who hadn't used it all night. Something moved near the ladder. A figure stood sideways against the railing, tall, wrapped in a coat that had seen better years. For a second, I thought I recognized the curve of the neck, the angle of the shoulders, and my chest jumped with the ridiculous hope that it might be Ruthie, or even Sam, come to tease me for prowling at this hour. The silhouette turned. The face was pale and thin, hair pinned up like a photograph. When the lantern hit it, my stomach dropped. The woman was older than any picture I'd seen of May. Her eyes were the kind that seemed to know the last thing you did wrong. "Mason," she said, and the name was sifting sand through a sieve. Familiar, but distant. She didn't call me by my full name. She used the childhood nickname only my father ever used. The sound cut deeper than any blade. "May?" I asked, and the word felt absurd in my mouth. If she was alive, she'd be very old. If she was not, then I was doing something stupid by speaking at all. The town had rumors enough to choke on, and yet here I was, holding a photograph and talking to someone who shouldn't have been standing on the pier. She smiled, and it was emotion that seemed to belong to another era. Another camera altogether. "You've come," she said. "You always come when the lake calls." "How?" My sentences kept breaking. The lantern dimpled in the slight wind, and for a moment the world was paper thin. I wanted to ask whether this was a trick, a prank, if Sam had staged something to mess with me. I wanted to ask if my father had known. Instead, I kept my eyes on her hands, which were empty but trembling. "You shouldn't be here alone," she said. Her voice was the same hum, now steady as if she'd been practicing it to hold something at bay. "Your father hit me the truth. He promised I'd be safe." Her gaze slid to the boathouse door like a knife finding a seam. But promises can sink. The hair on my arms rose. What truth? I asked. About what happened? About the letters? May's laugh had no humor in it. Letters are paper, she said. Paper keeps secrets, but it also rots. She stepped closer, the board creaking under her weight. Up close, I could see the lines of a life, fisherman's hands, weathered and knotted. The moon made her eyes two dark coins. There are things in the water, Mason. Things your father raked up and buried between his toes. You keep digging, and you find what the lake tried to forget. I wanted to reach out, to touch her arm and make all of this make sense. I wanted my father back in his recliner, telling me a story I'd already heard. Instead, my hand found a scrap of paper tucked into the toy boat, another note, smaller, the edges damp. In neat, tight handwriting, it read, "Meet me by the buoy. Midnight. Don't bring anyone." I hadn't even noticed the time. The old clock in me that kept to the town's rhythm told me it had to be near midnight, though the sky argued it was later. If the meeting referenced on that scrap and the footprint and May's presence were all part of the same knot, then I was already inside whatever story my father and May had started without me. "Why did you come?" she asked, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of old lavender and river mud. "Did you come for answers or to keep something from happening again?" Before I could answer, the water below the pier slapped hard against the pilings like a hand throwing a stone. The lantern light wavered. My breath left me in a small, ragged mist. A cold pressure slid along my ribs, the kind that's not quite fear and not quite memory. I felt watched, not by May, but by whatever shared the lake with all of us. Then the lantern blew out. It wasn't a gust. The flame simply went away, as if something else had swallowed it. For a heartbeat, the world was a void where sound hung like loose bricks. I fumbled for the lighter in my pocket, fingers shaking, and in that instant I felt a touch on my shoulder. Not a friendly hand, not a grip that would steady me. It was a palm that pressed with the weight of someone who'd been underwater too long. "Mason," a voice whispered right beside my ear. Not May's, not my father's. It was thin and old and carried the same lullaby I'd heard earlier, twisted now into a minor key. The whisper said my name the way an undertow says it before it pulls you out. I spun. There was no one behind me. Only the railing, the toy boat bobbing in the dark water, and the wet imprint of a handprint on the wood that had not been there a second before, as clear as an accusation. I couldn't see May. I couldn't see the shoreline. The night felt like a held breath. And in the hush, the thing under the pier sighed. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The wet handprint stayed on the wood like a promise. For a moment, I couldn't tell whether it was the cold or something inside me that shook. I fumbled the lighter, struck it once, twice, the metal clicked and clicked with nothing happening, and when finally a tiny orange hunger took, the lantern threw a sickly halo that made the world look like a photograph smeared with oil. May was gone. Not gone like she'd walked away, gone like someone had erased her from the night. 1 second, the space beside me had been a woman with weathered hands and a voice that knew my father's secrets. The next, nothing but the railing and the swollen dark water pressing under the pier. It felt like the world had blinked and decided to leave the important things out. My mind tried to assemble some ordinary reason. Maybe Sam had set up a scare as payback for me poking through his stories. Maybe the town had a prankster who liked antique photographs and drama. Maybe I'd been up too long, grief souring my sleep, but the handprint was warm on my palm where I touched it, and warmth is not a joke. I followed the boards toward the buoy. The scrap of paper in the toy boat had said, "Meet me by the buoy. Midnight. Don't bring anyone." The note felt less like an invitation now and more like the beginning of a map drawn by a hand with a tremor. The buoy swung on a chain a few yards out, an orange dot bobbing in the black. And when I walked out onto the end of the pier, the sea seemed to inhale me. Something tugged at the chain. Not a strong pull. A careful, almost polite motion like someone testing the water's patience. I peered over the side and the light fell on something white, lodged under the pier. A coil of rope with a knot tied so old it had become part of itself. I leaned down. The smell rose up then, an iron, old and thin, that set my teeth on edge. A single hair floated in the water, caught on a splinter. It was pale, human, and finer than any fisherman's beard. I called out because you call for answers when the world folds and you want it to unfold again. Hello? Who's there? The only answer was the slap of water against the pilings and the way the harbor seemed to listen without agreeing. By the time I made it back to the boathouse, my hands were raw from the rope and my head full of questions that sounded like stones rolling down in my skull. I found the photograph again and looked harder at the woman whose braid had once been a rope. There was a man in the picture too, younger than my father later looked, with a hat tipped down. He was not my father's father, and his smile was thin as a coin. When I turned the photograph, there was something I hadn't seen before. In the lower right corner, almost hidden beneath a water stain, someone had scribbled initials, J.K. My father's name was Alan Hale. His friends called him Al. No J.K. in the family. Sam had known everyone. If there was a J.K., Sam would know. The next morning, I kept my hands busy and my mouth quieter. I told Eli about the boathouse, the photograph, the buoy. He stopped mid-sentence while loading shingles into his truck and looked at me like I was trying on someone else's coat. Mason, you don't mess with things out on the pier, he said finally. That water keeps its own ledger. People forget that. Look, if you're gonna poke with gloves on. Ask Sam, he'll talk straight. Sam's house was a tangle of nets and old beer cans and the kind of years stacked in every corner. When I showed him the photograph, he held it like a relic, thumb rubbing the name May until he made it shine. J.K., he said, and his voice boxed me in. James Kirkland. Ran the shipyard for a while back in the 70s. Not a bad man, but when he drank, he could be a storm. Did my father know him? I asked. Sam spat into his ashtray and did not smile. Knew him, yeah. Knew him like you know the tide. They were part of the same crowd, late nights, the boathouse, secrets kept under oilskins. But there's one thing folks don't tell you when they tell you stories. Silence can be a kind of pact. Your dad and Kirkland had a pact once. What kind? I asked, and the room tightened. Sam had a way of making a small confession seem like a verdict. About the Whitcomb girl, he said. The name landed like a flat stone. May had a girl, Jenny Whitcomb, small, quick, used to run up and down Harbor Street like she owned it. One summer, she went missing. Folks looked, they did, but the kind of looking that gets results, that didn't happen. People are too busy. People are too scared. You're saying? I began. Sam turned the photograph over in his hands. I'm saying your father and James Kirkland and a few others had been drinking the night Jenny disappeared. I'm saying there were arguments, money, debts, a car that shouldn't have been left running. I'm saying people whisper names and then the lake takes what it wants. I felt a heat in my face that was not just anger, but a peculiar, private kind of betrayal. My father had been a man who could fix a motor or balance the books. He was the kind of neighbor who volunteered at the church bake sale. He had also been the man who carried letters and photos like secret contraband. Was he capable of being part of something that led to a child's disappearance? The question ate its way through me. That night, Pastor Jim stopped by. He had a face like a hymn, soft, steady, and when I told him what I'd found, he sat on the stoop and listened like one of us at the congregation. When I reached the part about May on the pier, his hands tightened around his coffee cup. Mason, he said quietly, there are sins and then there are things that aren't named even by sin. Churches bury a lot of them because bodies are messy and secrets are easier to keep, but if a wrong happened and it wasn't fixed, sometimes the hurt keeps knocking. It wants a reckoning. I asked him if the church had ever been involved in anything with the Whitcombs. He looked at his hands, then up, and said, we prayed, we missed. That is not an excuse. It's the truth. I started sleeping in the living room after that, the light on, the TV making small, meaningless noise. The lake felt like a patient thing, waiting. A week of small discoveries, a rusted key under the porch, a ledger with names and numbers, a neighbor who remembered a truck with a dented bumper, aggregated into a kind of pressure. Each piece on its own might have been nothing. Together they stacked like old plank work, making a way up from the dark. Then one evening, May came to my window. She didn't knock. She was just there, leaning against the clapboard like she'd found the exact place her shadow wanted to rest. She looked smaller than on the pier, as if the years had been measured off her like shavings. Her eyes were tired but steady, and when she spoke, she did not waste breath on small talk. You shouldn't have looked for her, she said. But you did. That's what your blood makes you do. It searches. Why are you back? I whispered. If Jenny, if whatever, why come to me? You're the one with his key, she said. You're the one who opens doors that were meant to stay closed. And because you asked, I'll tell you what I know. Her voice folded around the words like a hand finding a wrist. But you must promise to listen without fixing it. Sometimes trying to fix breaks more than what's already cracked. I promised, because what else do you promise when someone offers truth wrapped in warning? She set a small envelope on my porch step and slipped away before I could stop her. Inside was a single folded paper. On it, in a handwriting that trembled but was unmistakable, were 3 lines: a date, a place, the old shipyard, and a name, Jenny Whitcomb. That night, the lake did not sleep. It churned like a beast that had been nudged awake. I felt the pull to go, to stand at the edge where so many things met and clashed. I walked toward the pier with the envelope in my pocket and Sam's words like pebbles in my mouth. The town's lights glowed like watchful eyes. Behind me, the house felt too small for the kind of truth I was carrying. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I walked the shipyard like a man following a breath. The envelope said a date and a place. A late summer night years ago, where the tide and a drunk man's temper had decided something no one wanted named. The salt on my lips felt like an accusation. I'd promised May I would listen without trying to fix, but promises with grief in them are slippery things. I had to know. I had to do something that would make the whispering stop. The yard at night is all iron and shadow. Old cranes folded like sleeping beetles, hulks of rusted barges leaning into the dark, and the scent of oil that never quite leaves the place. I moved between piles of coiled cable and stacked pallets, the envelope burning in my pocket. The date matched the ledger Sam had shown me, the one with names and numbers and a series of entries in my father's handwriting. I remembered Sam's face when he'd said their names, like a man admitting to carrying something too heavy to lift any longer. I found the spot May's note pointed toward, an old concrete slab where a workbench had been. The slab had a hairline crack near the edge, and when I scraped it with my fingernail, the dust came away in a thin, chalky cloud. Underneath, where the concrete hadn't quite sealed against time, something small had been tucked and forgotten, or kept. I chipped slower than I'd ever moved in my life, my heart thudding against a ribcage that felt like it might split. There was a tin box, wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a child's locket, half the chain gone, the metal green with age. Nestled with it was a small photograph. Jenny, maybe 8, grinning with a gap in her front teeth and a slash of candy sticky on her lip. There were also receipts, a crumpled ticket stub, and, in shaky writing, a note that looked like my father's. We couldn't save her. I'm sorry. Tell May. Al, the confession hit me harder than any blow. My father had not been innocent of secrecy. He had been complicit in the covering up, and then he had been crushed by it. Footsteps creaked behind me on the planks. I didn't turn right away. I had imagined quarrels with Sam. I had imagined bitter confessions. But the figure who stepped into the light was James Kirkland's boy, Rob Kirkland, a man I'd never met before that night. He looked older than his years, shoulders bowed like someone carrying a rusted anchor. His face had the same hard line as the photograph's man with the hat. You found what he hid, Rob said. His voice was raw, like someone scraping at old scabs. Thought that box would be gone when I died. Thought the lake took the worst of it. But it doesn't, does it? It hangs around and wraps on the hull. You knew? I asked. The question was a rock in my mouth. Rob closed his eyes. Knew, yeah. I was there after the fact. We were all there. Your dad tried to make it right. He put things back. He left letters in hopes someone would find them. Kirkland, my old man, he lost his temper. Jenny got scared and ran. It turned into an argument. We did something stupid and terrible. He spat on the ground and the sound